Not refreshing. Yeah, alright. Let me hop into Discord. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and the familia, mammals, reptiles, primates, and great flightless birds, I welcome you to yet another episode of Agent Smith. This is episode 35. Isn't that astounding? I think it is. I'm really glad that we can continue to do this segment. I know it is a little bit more niche than some other video game content because we talk about stuff outside of video games. But it's peaceful, it's educational, it's informative, and I, for one, am excited to be informed whilst continuing to play StarCraft games. So, on that note, let's begin. Let's get it started. Hopping into the Discord with none other than Agent Smith himself. Agent Smith, hello, how are you doing?
Hello? Hey. How are you?
Oh, somewhere between a shit fire and ass poop. How are you?
Better than that.
Okay, that's good. That's a good start.
Kind of a down day.
Yeah, well, it's one of those where you kind of wake up feeling a little bit off. You go to the gym and you're feeling off. You start streaming and it's okay, but then you lose a whole bunch and then it's like, yeah, this is annoying. But aside from that, surviving, thriving, I'm healthy. Feeling pretty strong physically, so we're okay.
Okay.
Yeah. But what a hell of a week, dude. So the thing that is number one on my list, and people already asked about the shooting, but that kind of seems like the drum that we've already beaten 1,000 times. Of like, yes, America has a gun violence problem. What else would you like to know?
Yeah.
But it was that day. It was the terrible Tuesday or Wednesday where it was Cohen and Manafort.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like, once again, in the Mueller drama train. But it seemed like it was more tangible stuff than we've had before of,
yeah,
there's a list of stuff, and it puts Trump in a position where, does he pardon these guys or not? Because that says a lot about his alignment with them and whether or not he's going to kind of stand up against felonies. These are felonies here.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a lot more tangible, and it kind of gave people something more to chew on. In the case of Cohen, the evidence that they got him on was generated from a raid on his, I think, his office. He's a lawyer, so they raided his office as a part of the Mueller investigation. And with the evidence that was generated, there was a different charge that was raised, I think, by the state of New York. I hope chat can correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the state of New York that brought in charges against him on various counts of like embezzlement and stuff like that, basically various financial crimes. And it was kind of predicated on those that he's promising to cooperate more in these other investigations. So
Well,
it's kind of
the big buzz one that I think implicated Trump was the two former adult entertainers who got some hush money directly from campaign funds. And the question is, do they have direct evidence that Trump asked for Cohen to do this, versus did Cohen just kind of take care of this to clear things up without Trump knowing? Because I think that's a pretty big difference in how much trouble Trump would be in from this. But in any case, I feel like that's one thing that your average American can agree upon of, that's generally not what voters are trying to go for with where their money is spent.
well, it depends on who you ask.
Nah. I guess some people would be like, if I could do that, I would. Burp.
Well, I even had an article on the Twitter today that was from the BBC where they were asking some people about Trump supporters, basically what they thought about all the charges and the investigation and all that. And I mean, they all basically said the same thing, that they don't really care about all of this, that they think it's a witch hunt, and that they focus more on the things that he's done that they believe are positive, you know, like the economy and some of the other red meat issues that he's delivered on. So for them, it's a sideshow. They don't really care that much about it. It's kind of the same way Democrats felt in the 90s when Clinton was being investigated for perjury as part of the Ken Starr investigation. or as a result of the Kinstar investigation, or whatever the proper context of that was. But it's the same idea. They're not, they're not going to jump ship because of this, is the impression I have. It's not going to sink him in terms of his base's support. But he could still be impeached. There could be a critical mass of support for impeachment at some point if the charges against Cohen and Manafort result in substantive progress in the overarching Mueller investigation. Or maybe if there's something unrelated that pops up that is sufficiently motivating for congressmen to get them to push for impeachment. It just depends on the context. It's not, you raise a good point about the need to, establish whether Cohen was acting at the behest of Trump versus on his own initiative. But even if he's acting on behest of Donald Trump, there's another question that would have to be asked and proved in court, which is whether or not Donald Trump was asking for that payment in order to influence the election, or if he was asking for it in order simply to defend his own reputation. Mm-hmm. The latter would be legal, the former would be illegal. And it's going to be difficult to ascertain which of them it is, because that's kind of a subjective thing. And we've talked a bit before about how subjective the process of impeachment is in any case. If Congress really wanted to, they could probably bag him for just about anything. Mm-hmm. So even if they found him guilty of certain crimes and misdemeanors, as it were, they would not inherently, necessarily impeach him. And if they don't find him guilty of sundry crimes and misdemeanors, they could still impeach him, just depending on if they had the votes. So right now there is more meat to the Mueller investigation, and I know some people are calling it, impeachment and push towards impeachment. There's a long way to go before you can even really talk about impeachment as a serious option. There needs to be more discussion and negotiation there amongst not only Democrats but also Republicans, and I think everybody's holding their breath for the midterms before they start thinking about any kind of impeachment. And even then, I think it's going to be a stretch given what they have now. So I'm still in we'll see mode. There is more content as far as the Mueller investigation and all that. So definitely there's more to think about, but right now I still don't think it's enough for impeachment, for there to be enough political support for impeachment or for any substantive move on that in that vein. Mm-hmm. Wait until the midterms, basically, is what I would say.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens then.
Well, another big piece that was, late last night or early today, was McCain passed.
Ah, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and how, historically speaking, he's been kind of purple in terms of his alignment. Like, he's more right than left, but he's not really a loyalist establishment Republican who's just going to vote with all the other Republicans. He's historically kind of flipped on some pretty crucial stuff, like Trump's health care bill. Yeah. He was the one who kind of went across the aisle on that. And there was a fun George Bush joke that he made at one of the dinners where he said something along the lines of, welcome Democrats, Republicans, and John McCain. So it's kind of cool that he's not only served the country in the military and as a POW, but he also is really his own senator, his own politician, where you can't really say that he's just going with whatever the party tells him to do. He's trying to serve his country the best he can. So I feel kind of bad in that sense because he's more storied than a lot of other Republicans, and he also kind of tends to represent someone who thinks for himself, which he may not be the smartest person of all time, but at least he tried, I think.
Yeah, that's a pretty good read. He was more of a nationalist than he was a Republican. And so he kind of fell into the Republican coalition on that count, but, nationalism and the projection of American power and the ostensible defense of liberty around the world, some people think that's a cover, some don't. I won't tell people what to believe on that, but nominally he was dedicated to pushing a program of liberty, economic and political, around the world. and believed that doing so was not only in the interests of other places, but also the United States. So he was very much of that old school sort of American power conservatism. And he did tend to pick and choose his issues more according to American strength, the strength of the country as a whole, rather than particular political ideologies. Yeah, I think he kind of lost some of that reputation when he ran for president in 2008 because he had to make a lot of compromises to try to get out the vote. And, that was kind of a poison pill. I think the GOP kind of threw him under the bus on that one. Because after 8 years of the Bush administration, everybody kind of knew that there was a big train wreck coming for the GOP in the 2008 elections. There wasn't a lot of hope that they would be able to win that. And Barack Obama was able to make that even more likely because he was sufficiently charismatic in order to really build up a lot of momentum. So just going into the 2008 election, it seemed like long odds that the GOP was going to do well. And I think the GOP just kind of gave it to McCain. And obviously there were primaries and whatnot, and McCain was an attractive candidate for a lot of people for different reasons. But, it was just really hard to compete that year. And in order to get out the vote, I think he had to do some things just to try to appeal to the base, the Republican base, that he might not otherwise have done. But because he did do them, he ended up kind of losing some of his reputation as a moderate. The Sarah Palin thing being the case in point, that was one example. A lot of people on the left hated Sarah Palin. And, that was a very opportunistic choice. In fairness to Sarah Palin, I would question how much of her public image that resulted from the '08 election was really her so much as the GOP PR machine. They probably wanted to give her that specific image to appeal to people.
Well, it worked. If I can give an example, my mom loves Sarah Palin because Sarah Palin talks in terms that she understands. So it's kind of like the mom vote, where Sarah Palin represents, she's a mom of kids, she drives them to hockey practice, all of this Alaskan-American mom kind of stuff, which is a big chunk. Like half the country is women, so Sarah Palin, they were kind of thinking, well, let's get her to be the super mom who's in politics, and moms everywhere are just going to be clamoring to vote for her, which I think worked for some people.
Yeah.
But you're right. It didn't really represent who McCain was. Like, it wasn't really a politician who thought like he thought. It was someone who captured a different demographic than he did.
Yeah, and that's normal for the vice president pick. Most politicians in the United States, when they're running for president, will try to pick a vice president that appeals to a demographic that they themselves are weak on, that are not themselves necessarily that attractive to. So the vice presidency is meant to try to get some of that vote back that they might otherwise have lost. And so Sarah Palin was kind of that. And she was not a bad politician per se in Alaska. I think a lot of her public image kind of covered up the work she did in Alaska as a reformist candidate. She actually did fight and win against the oil companies in Alaska. And, obviously a lot of people disagreed about some of her other politics, probably social politics in particular. But she did decent work up there, and that's one of the reasons why they picked her. She was a fresh face, she was a reformist, so she didn't have strong ties to the establishment, so you can't say she's an establishment candidate. And they just kind of ran her into the ground a bit. It probably didn't help much that she really ran with it herself. She really didn't fight back much on that count. She really embraced the image and kind of ran with it and almost did a kind of reality TV thing afterwards.
What do you mean, almost?
Well, I don't know if she did that because she just wanted to commercialize her popularity or if she just wanted to stay in the public eye so that she could run for president later. And maybe it was both. They're not mutually exclusive. But I can't say for sure which it was. But John McCain himself, was not well represented there, and so people kind of turned on him a bit. But that was kind of his big shot. He almost became president in the year 2000. And he just lost in the primaries to George W. Bush. I think I remember there was they got catty with each other at one point during a debate. I don't remember exactly what the nature of it was, but George W. Bush got the better of it. I think maybe that was the famous philosopher question, I might be wrong on that, but they were asking each candidate which philosopher had most influenced them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which philosopher? And of course, George W. Bush hit a home run when he said Jesus Christ.
Oh, wow. Got the Christian vote.
Dang, that was bang. It was a good move. That was slick. Nobody else picked up on that either. All of the other ones were picking, you know, just different obscure philosophers. George W., man, he knew how to play that card.
Amen.
He hit it. So John McCain, unfortunately, didn't do well in 2000, so he didn't get the nomination, and so then he ended up kind of being sort of uncomfortably in the middle. You know, there was a big lurch to the right after 2000 because of 9/11, and so John McCain was a little too far from that right, too far in the middle to really kind of benefit from that. And by the time that rightward lurch had kind of changed in 2008, the politics had swung the other way, and he was on the outside looking in again. And then after that, he was kind of too old to keep running for president, so he just kind of backed out.
Mm-hmm.
I will say this, I have a relative who actually met him, because I have relatives who fought in Vietnam,
Mm-hmm.
and John McCain also fought in Vietnam, so he was kind of known in those circles, right, because he was around, and the relatives I have who met him kind of had the impression that he was a bit of an ambitious asshole. That kind of type of person. Like, he wanted to do things, and you better not get in his way.
Yeah, well, I mean, for any non-American people who don't know about him, he was a POW for some years, which I think it does things to you when you're behind enemy lines, captured and tortured and whatnot. So, I mean, taking that kind of in context with who he is as a person, it makes a lot of sense. Like, who he is as a politician and as a person. And also the sense of urgency, I think, is a little bit different when you've been in that kind of circumstance. Of like, not only is this important, he was talking about how he understands what we're fighting for and the worst of what can happen to a person and all that, which, like you're saying, it is a very nationalistic kind of approach to it. But that's his motivation.
Well, they mostly knew him before that. That was kind of his personality beforehand. Afterwards, who's to say? Obviously, it didn't dent his ambition, because he definitely went all out. They also had personal criticisms of him, but, you know, that's personal preference. You know, we're talking about John McCain, the politician, and as a politician, he definitely was very driven. He was a patriotic, driven politician. We still have a few. There's a few left. I remember back in the day, during the Iraq War, some of the better congressmen that kind of challenged the dominant zeitgeist at that time. Because, you know, if you remember that period, if you lived in the United States after 9/11, and that first, like, 4 or 5 years after 9/11, people just lost their shit. They really did. They really just went all in on the whole war on terror thing. Like, they bit hard on that. And, you know, granted, there were reasons for it, but there's such a thing as taking it too far, and we still haven't really fully corrected from that, I would argue. That's a whole other conversation we could get into, though. But at that time, there were a few politicians who kind of held back and sort of challenged some of the things the government was doing. They didn't necessarily completely resist it, but they criticized it, critiqued it, and tried to offer some alternatives. And some of those guys ended up being pretty prescient in terms of the lack of wisdom in a lot of American foreign policy at that time. You know, that was guys like Chuck Hagel, Richard Lugar, Susan Collins back in the day. You know, those were some of the top guys back then doing that. And it was kind of because Chuck Hagel was respected for that he ended up being the Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration, even though he was a Republican and not a Democrat. You know, he was sufficiently respected on both sides of the aisle, amongst both Democrats and Republicans, that he was seen as an ideal candidate for Secretary of Defense. Unfortunately for him, the Obama administration was not terribly interested in the military's input on a lot of national security issues. They didn't particularly trust them. You know, that was the famous monopolization of national security issues by the National Security Council. And as a result, the Secretary of Defense ended up on the outside looking in on a number of policy questions. And That's why the Obama administration ended up with like 3 or 4 different secretaries of defense over the course of their run. You know, people would come in, get frustrated, and then quit because they didn't really feel like they had any real power. You know, people would go over their heads. People would talk to their, people. Yeah, I mean, you just didn't really have as much authority as you should have, basically. And so those guys kind of left. But he was a good choice. He was a good guy. Richard Lugar, it would have been nice if he could have stuck around too, but he ended up getting picked off during one of those, what would you call them, Tea Party offensives during the primary. He lost in a primary to a Tea Party candidate sometime between like 2010 and 2014, somewhere in there. So he's not around anymore. Susan Collins is still around, and she still does pretty good about trying to be in the middle and trying to be objective. She gets a lot of shit for it, though. I don't think she'll lose a primary, though, because if I remember correctly, she's a senator from Maine, and Maine is a pretty mellow place politically. You know, they're not real partisan up there like some places. So her seat is probably pretty safe, but I don't know how much room she has to maneuver. Because right now, the trend is very much towards more partisanship on left and right. So people in the middle are kind of getting to be a smaller and smaller demographic up there on Capitol Hill.
Mm-hmm.
I think she did form something like what they called a common sense coalition, which is common sense caucus, or some such thing. It was basically a bunch of moderates in Congress, both Democrat and Republican, that tried to come together and work on different political issues. And there was some hope that maybe they could generate enough momentum and votes to really kind of not necessarily hijack the agenda from the far left and far right up in Washington, but that maybe they could have sufficient influence in order to sort of deter their more destructive impulses. Kind of remains to be seen if they're going to be able to do that. They've already had some effect, but it's unclear what effect they'll have after the midterms kind of shake up seats and whatnot. Something else to watch going forward. But yeah, McCain was a pretty decent guy. Overall, pretty decent dude.
He tried.
Yeah, he tried. Keep an eye on his seat, because that's an open Senate seat over in Arizona, and that's been pretty hotly contested. Donald Trump, I think, is throwing some of his support behind the nominal establishment-supported candidate. I think it's a woman who was a female veteran pilot. So pretty decent nationalist credentials. That'll probably do well. But then he also threw even more support behind this wackadoodle primary challenger. So we'll see how that works out. Maybe the wackadoodle guy will win the primary and the election. You know, I've learned by now that you really can't call elections in advance. You never know who's going to win those things. But nominally, conventional wisdom would be if the far-right candidate wins the primary, then the Democrats are more likely, at least, to pick up the Senate seat in the general election.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of political drama in the United States these days. It's been very colorful the past few years.
Did you see that McCain is survived by his mom?
Oh, really?
Yeah, she's 107 or something.
Oh, powerhouse.
Yeah, never give up.
Well, thoughts and prayers, I guess, to her. It's never fun to lose your children, I'm sure, even at that age.
Yeah.
Did anything else catch your eye?
Don't think so. The Mueller-Cohen thing was the only thing that really kind of captivated my attention for more than 5 minutes. But,
Gotcha.
yeah, overall, I think a bit spicier of a week than we get sometimes. I haven't really seen much about the North Korea drama. I did read that Trump was going to go up there, but he canceled the trip because he was dissatisfied with their denuclearization rate or something.
Yeah, Pompeo got pulled from the negotiations. The Trump admin wasn't satisfied that there had been enough progress. There's been a lot of reports and leaks and whatnot suggesting that the North Koreans have actually been continuing their ballistic program, their ballistic missile program at least, if not also their nuclear program. And there's some suspicion that there might be merit to that, since the Chinese may be kind of buttering up to them, kind of as a negotiating tool in the trade negotiations that are ongoing. So we'll see. It's a little bit fuzzy and unclear right now, but it looks like that's not quite hit a wall yet, but that there is a lot of slowing in that trend. There had been a decent trend towards denuclearization, or so it had appeared at the time, but now the sheen is kind of coming off, and it may or may not be that that stops, or stops generating momentum at least going forward, and that we may be back to square one. It's an interesting question, because it's not clear what the Trump administration would do if they did have to start back from square one, because Trump himself already declared the issue basically solved, that they weren't a threat anymore. So it would seem he'd have to double back if he does have to start over, but it's not clear if his ego will allow that to happen. So I'm a bit curious about that. I would wonder how he personally would handle that kind of pseudo betrayal, that kind of what they used to call what would you call it, backsliding on the part of North Korea, and especially what they would do if China really started to throw their weight behind North Korea, because that could be a very effective strategy for them in the peripheral trade negotiations that are not directly related to the North Korea issue, but can become a part of the overarching negotiation. That can be a bargaining chip. But there's not a lot of new information there to go on, so we'll see. That's I'm watching it, but it's hard to read right now. You know, like so many things with regard to not only China, but the Trump administration, it's really hard to read signals.
Apparently my current ladder opponent is a fan of you, and he wanted to say hi.
Well, thank you. Thank you, mysterious stranger. I appreciate the compliment.
Some European Grandmaster Protoss.
Oh, nice. Well, there wasn't much else I had for the past week. You know, I've still got a whole pages of notes from just the past several months.
We do have Strophium on point for questions today.
Questions, yeah. So that's what I'll. Thank you, Strophium, and yeah, that's what I'll get into now. Let's see what we've got here. Could you talk about examples of countries that have recently established a democratic government? Example, post-Arab Spring, regarding what works, didn't work, and why? Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, that's you're not going to get as good an answer out of me as you could from some poli-sci guy, because they've probably been following that stuff a lot more closely and know more about specific reforms and institutional changes and setups than I do. But let me see if I can think of an example, and maybe I can chew on it a bit. I'm going to assume you mean transitions, because there are countries that are just new countries that were recently created, so you could technically count those as new, recently established democratic governments, but I assume you mean governments that recently transitioned from a non-democratic to a democratic government. Burma, kind of. Burma is kind of an example, and I say kind of because it's not a full democracy. I mean, the military has a lot of power with the way the Burmese constitution is written. I think something like 25% of the seats in the legislature in Burma is reserved for candidates that are nominated and appointed by the Burmese military. Actually, I should say Myanmar. Technically, they renamed themselves Myanmar in the late 80s, so the Myanmar legislature. So that's kind of an example, but you know, like I just said, you know, the issue there is that the military kind of retains disproportionate power. And another aspect of the constitution in Myanmar is that the military has, oh, how do I put it? Responsibility. The military has sole responsibility for internal security in Myanmar, as well as external security. And I'm not entirely clear on if that includes foreign policy. I suspect it might, but not necessarily. But I know it definitely encompasses internal security. So internal security measures, operations, etc. The President Aung Suu Kyi, or de facto President Aung Suu Kyi, does not have power over that. Like, the whole Rohingya issue is a good case in point, and we've actually talked about this before. Aung Suu Kyi cannot tell the military to stop killing Rohingya. She literally does not have, well, I shouldn't say literally, but she does not have that constitutional authority to do that. She has no legal authority to make the military do much of anything. So she kind of gets a bad rap for that. To be fair, she hasn't done much on the political side of things to kind of name and shame them or whatnot, but there are reasons for that as well. You know, again, we've discussed that before as to why she's doing that. But the point is, if you are going to democratize, on the one hand, you want, ideally, a fully democratic constitution that gives power to the people and representatives of the people, you know, political parties and whatnot. But on the other hand, if you're dealing with an authoritarian regime, or a military regime, as was the case with Myanmar, and the best you can do is a relatively liberal constitution with disproportionate military power, with some illiberal aspects, sometimes you just gotta take what you can get, because at least that's progress. At least you're moving in the right direction. So that's a judgment call individual democratization movements have to make, and in the case of Myanmar, they judged that it was worth the effort. It was worth it even if it was an imperfect arrangement, as it kind of clearly is. Let me see, so what are some other examples? I'm sure there's some. Thailand is sort of the opposite. Thailand had a democratic government, but the military staged a coup some years ago, and so it's been a de facto military dictatorship since. The military said after the coup that they would hold elections within a year. And then a year later they said, okay, well we're going to have them a year from now, because we still don't think we're ready. And so they've just continually kicked the can down the road ever since. Eventually they did have actual elections once they implemented a new constitution, but it was kind of the same deal as Myanmar, where the military had disproportionate power in the legislature, and yeah, it was a little bit bullshit, basically. It's not as bad as Myanmar, but it's pretty clear the Thai military thinks they know what's best for Thailand, and that they don't trust the political class, or if not also the citizenry. There's a whole political history there to Thailand that we could get into. It's kind of a interesting story. We can dig into that if somebody wants to. You know, tag Strophium Matt and direct questions towards him if you have any. Who else? Recent democratization. East Timor is a relatively new country, but I wouldn't say they transitioned from one. They had been part of Indonesia. South Sudan is similar. That used to be a part of Sudan. That's a new country. But they didn't transition from an authoritarian to a democratic state, per se. There are lessons there, but mostly with regard to East Timor and South Sudan, it just has more to do with making sure you have capacity, you know, governing capacity with which to govern the country. Because a lot of the problems East Timor and South Sudan have had after independence have had to do with a weak government, weak rule of law, and just an inability of the respective governments to monopolize violence within their respective countries, such that there's been a lot of instability and a lot of violence of one sort or another. More violence in South Sudan than East Timor, but East Timor also has problems. I think there was a militia there that almost overthrew the government at one point. Let's see, transit. I mean, the obvious case study is Eastern Europe, but that's not really recent. You know, all of those Eastern European countries transitioned from communism to liberal democracies, and did so relatively quickly within just a few years. In those cases, they mostly did a pretty good job. I mean, the challenge they faced was balancing justice with reconciliation. And that's a really hard balance to strike. I mean, on the one hand, there's a lot of leftover politicians from the communist era who, in a lot of cases, are still involved in politics even today in those countries. And how much do you trust them? You know, having been authoritarians at one point, or at least a part of an authoritarian political party, how much scope do you give them to compete in a democratic political environment? Can you trust them not to return to old habits, so to speak? And even if you trust them not to return the country to authoritarianism, can you trust them not to return to the corrupt political culture of communism? That's one of the big problems a lot of post-communist states have faced, even though they democratized the corruption and the culture of corruption that was instilled during the era, the communist era, kind of survived in and bled into the liberal democratic era. So, you know, they're nominally competing in democratic elections, but that sense of entitlement, that sense that corruption is okay so long as you get away with it, that's kind of a political norm in a lot of those societies, especially in the Balkans. And that's been devilishly difficult to overcome. I think there were big protests in Romania, basically over that, anti-corruption protests. There was also a lot of discussion about what to do about liberalizing the economy, but that's different than building a government. You know, the question asked focused on democratic institutions specifically, so I won't get into economic institutions. That was a very difficult challenge in and of itself faced by Eastern Europe after the Cold War. Gosh, who else? There must be some really obvious answer that I'm missing, some really obvious example. Maybe Nepal. Let me think. I don't know that that was recent. I think that was like 2006 or so. Something around there, I want to say. But basically, Nepal had been a constitutional monarchy, with emphasis on the monarchy rather than the constitutional. I think even at that point, it had only relatively recently become a constitutional monarchy. And the problem with Nepal was that, specifically with the monarchy, is that the king was not willing to give voice, or at least not willing to give sufficient voice to a broad enough segment of the public in political decision-making. And the result was a Maoist revolution. And yeah, I think they did just call themselves Maoists. There are Maoist revolutionaries in India too, but they actually call themselves something different. But in Nepal, the Maoists staged a long revolution, a long guerrilla campaign. It was very difficult for the government, and eventually the monarchy alienated even the people that had been supporting it, people on the right and in the centrist middle. Even those people eventually turned on them because the government was kind of seen as ineffective and corrupt and etc. Not moving fast enough with reforms, all that jazz. So eventually everybody turned on the monarchy. The monarch basically abdicated, and there was a ceasefire announced, and the Maoists got together with all of the other political parties and negotiated a new constitution, which was very difficult, and had elections. Everybody hated the communists, though, except the Maoists anyway. And so it was really bizarre. I think it was in that first election that they had. The Maoists were easily the largest single political party. They got almost 40–50% of the vote, something like that. It was, all they would have needed is like one coalition partner, and they would have had enough seats to become the party in power. But because all of the other parties were some variety of conservative or liberal or what have you, basically they did not like communism. All of those other political parties got together and formed a giant super coalition. And again, the only thing they had in common was they didn't want the Maoists to be in control. But that was enough to pull together all of these different political parties from across the spectrum to make a giant coalition, and they were just barely able to keep them out. It didn't last, which is predictable. I think they were only around for a couple years, if that, before the differences between them resulted in a new election, and eventually the Maoists did form a government in conjunction with a kingmaker communist party of some kind. Maybe it wasn't communist, but hard left socialist. But there was basically another leftist political party that didn't get as many votes as the Maoists, but the Maoists needed to form a coalition, a ruling coalition. And they kind of kept the Maoists in check, so to speak. Kept them from doing anything too radical. There's been kind of a running political battle between all those different factions since then. I don't think the Maoists have been able to win as much power as they got in that first election. But anyway, the original question had to do with lessons learned. Like, what do you take away from that? I think in the case of Nepal, it really says that if you're going to have a new constitution and new elections, make sure that you reach consensus. And it's really hard to reach consensus amongst a lot of different political actors and parties. And, you know, inherently, you have to make concessions. But, you know, if you don't please everybody, then there's some question about whether or not that largest political group will just overturn the table and seize power. Hypothetically, the Maoists could have done that. So consensus is very important. To a degree, they did get that. to be fair to Nepal, it's not like a complete mess. Like, they did have consensus, they did have a negotiated settlement, and it's been shaky at times, but for the most part, it's been more or less working since then. So that's not so much something that went wrong that you can learn from, but something that went right that you can learn from in Nepal's case. Let's see. Tunisia is the obvious example from the Arab Spring. That's pretty much the only big real success story from the Arab Spring. And it's been up and down for them. They definitely have a democratic government and people want to maintain those democratic institutions, but it's been really hard because nobody's managed to really solve the fundamental economic problems that started the Arab Spring in the first place. And so that's creating some tensions, especially in the rural areas. And there's been some concern about terrorism, not only with terrorism itself, but also with the government's response. You know, there's been sundry emergency emergency counterterrorism laws passed, and emergency powers have been at times granted to the government, and that's basically exactly how they ended up in authoritarian dictatorship in the first place. Ben Ali basically came to power. Ben Ali was the dictator who ruled Tunisia before the Arab Spring. He came to power and basically ruled through emergency powers that were granted to the presidency in Tunisia. So that was how his authoritarian regime operated, legally speaking. So there was some concern in Tunisia that perhaps they were kind of retreading that ground, that maybe they were giving the government too many powers to fight terrorism. And there's still questions about a lack of reform amongst security institutions like the police. You know, there's still a culture of an unaccountability amongst police institutions in Tunisia. And so that's obviously a negative. You know, it would be very easy to use that culture to your advantage if you were an unscrupulous politician looking to find allies with which to seize power. So institutional culture amongst certain key institutions, like national security institutions, that would have to change in order for Tunisia's long-term political stability to be assured. But as for lessons learned from the experience, I mean, those are problems that are just inherently difficult to solve. How many powers does the government need with which to fight terrorism? You know, how dangerous is a terrorist threat? And how do you change institutional culture? Those are difficult questions to answer in any society. You know, we faced a lot of the same problems in the United States, and still do. You know, how much power does the government need to fight the war on terror? A lot of different people have different ideas about that. Institutional culture is a big hot topic right now because that's a big part of the problem with the police in the United States as an institution. You know, there's a lot of questions about militarization of the police, about institutional racism amongst the police as an institution. So how do you change institutional cultures in the police such that you can reverse those trends? If indeed you think that's a problem, obviously that's a debate in and of itself, but regardless, that's a question, that's an open topic, and it's not really one that anybody has like a really solid answer to one way or the other. So even the United States, we kind of struggle with that. I think in the case of the United States, we do better because we have, one, a stronger democratic culture. We have a liberal democratic political culture in which not only the citizenry, but politicians and bureaucrats themselves understand the limits of their power. You know, even if there's something that they could legally do, they don't necessarily do it because it would break a de facto norm that helps maintain the overall stability of the political system. You know, that's a big... democratic norms are a big part of maintaining a stable democracy and maintaining liberal democratic institutions. And countries that have recently transitioned to liberal democracy often struggle with that. That's one of the big problems they face, because there are so many people left over from the previous regime that they still kind of have that same culture of unaccountability and corruption. So kind of conditioning politicians in particular, but also the citizenry writ large, to understand that they have a role to play in maintaining democracy beyond simply observing the law, you know, the specific letter of the law, and extending into their personal behavior and their own self-restraint. That's the big step that really needs to happen to really make democratic reform stick. But that's not an easy thing to do, and there's no like one good way to do it. Like, there's no one golden rule how to change a political culture. It just takes a lot of sustained effort and pressure on the part of reformers, and a lot of, probably not a little bit of luck, because a lot of political legitimacy for a given regime depends on power, on factors outside of its power. You know, if the economy has a big downturn, then it almost doesn't matter who's in power. They invariably get blamed for it. You know, so if there were some catastrophe of some kind, it may be that a democratic experiment just can't succeed no matter what, because so many people blame it. You kind of saw that in Russia. You know, in Russia, the 90s were just garbage in so many ways, you know, economically, politically, in terms of security and crime, and there was a lot of problems in Russia in the 90s. And the liberal democratic regime, and so much as it was liberal democratic, there are some issues there as well. Liberal democracy got a bad name as a result, and it kind of has lasted all the way up until now. You know, liberal democracy is kind of a dirty word in a lot of ways amongst broad parts of Russia's population as a result. So in the case of Tunisia, you know, the challenge there is that ambiguous, amorphous challenge of changing the culture of politics and trying to change institutional culture and dealing with those difficult questions that any democracy faces, but that are particularly thorny for a new democracy which lacks some of that overarching social infrastructure that could otherwise immunize them from the temptations of discretionary government authority that comes with some of that national security debate. I guess you could say Yemen transitioned to democracy, but that was never really fully completed. That's kind of a mixed bag there. You know, liberal democracy in Yemen tried to take off after Saleh was overthrown, but the new government was never able to get legitimacy. They were never able to really reform political institutions effectively. In fact, it was their effort to reform how provinces were drawn that helped spark the current conflict. A lot of people were upset at the way the provinces were drawn. It was felt that that would have marginalized certain people, and so that helped feed dissatisfaction with the regime, such that a lot of people allied with the Houthis when they invaded eventually. The Houthis themselves sensed that lack of legitimacy, and that was part of the reason they attacked. You know, they sensed that the government wouldn't be able to really effectively resist, wouldn't have enough popular support to effectively resist. And that's been a problem that's dogged the Hadi government ever since. In a case like Yemen, I would say the takeaway would be, you know, if you're going to have a transition, try to build a broad coalition. You know, in Yemen, they just, well, build a broad coalition, but also try to deliver on your promises. If you promise to reform the economy and reform political institutions, you've really got to deliver something. And you have to have a strong enough coalition such that any problems in that process can be papered over amongst the different various groups. In Yemen, the ruling coalition was weak, and there just was no there was no effective policy implementation. And the result was that the whole transition fell apart very early on. Recently democratized. I guess those are the examples that kind of come to mind, and I'm sorry if I'm forgetting, like, some very recent example that I should probably be remembering, but I can't seem to conjure anything within the past few years that would represent democratization. Like full, real, liberal, democratic democratization, I mean. I'm
As
sure
an
chat
aside,
will be able to trigger that on. What?
As an aside, I've been reading a book on the Viking art of war, which is a historical piece on the way that the Viking era kind of took place, militarily speaking, and it's pretty interesting how it kind of lines up with a lot of the other principles we've talked about of geography and military technology and whatnot. And it was basically the TLDR of how far I am in the book so far, which is like a third, is you've got three little places. It's mainly Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. And once they catch up to the current era of ships, they basically explode onto the European scene. No one really messed with Scandinavia before. It's cold and desolate. Why would we go there? Yeah. Kind of a situation. And then they show up and they're attacking stuff from coastal areas, and there was a huge power vacuum because, what's his name? Shit. I'm defending against a Reaper right now.
Get him.
Charlemagne.
There you
Charlemagne died, and his empire was such that it couldn't really be maintained by his sons and whatnot in the same way that he consolidated power for himself. So we've talked a lot about power vacuums of if there's big control of an area and then suddenly that's disrupted, then something's going to fill that vacuum. And you've got a bunch of different vassal kings and other people who are feuding over this area, which means that no one's quite as directed in defending themselves from random piracy and raids, which is how it started for the most part.
Yeah.
It's like they're venturing out, seeing what they can accomplish. If they can... Basically, their order of operations was, if we can just kill and loot, then we'll do that. But if they're really organized and they have good infrastructure, then we'll have a bloody nose and we'll have to do something else. So maybe we'll trade and we'll do mercenary work. So it's that kind of trial and error of, in the weak areas, they just plunder it. In the strong areas, like they went to the Byzantine Empire, and they were hired as mercenaries, which is pretty cool to think about.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a pretty rich and interesting history. It's not as well documented as some other historical phases because they weren't exactly the most literate at that time.
Mm-hmm. No, they definitely had a big influence on Europe.
Yeah.
And even regions farther afield than that. You know, they didn't just sail the Baltic Sea, for example, or the North Sea. They were also very proficient at navigating large rivers. And so they would, what they did is they actually navigated along the various river systems of Russia. You know, they would enter around the Baltic, or maybe the North Sea up there in the Arctic, and then they would sail down into middle Russia, southern Russia, the Ukraine, and into the Black Sea. So they had an influence even down there. In fact, I think I remember one of the legends for the Kievan Rus and their foundation is that some of the local Slavic city-states basically axed around for a king. And so they settled on this one Viking dude, or at least ostensibly a Viking dude. So supposedly that's how the first Russian state was founded. If you want to call that Russian. I know Ukrainians and Russians go back and forth about who owns the history of the Kievan Rus. I won't get into that. I'll let you guys sort that out yourselves. But they also went into the Mediterranean, and I remember reading a book about different crusades during the Middle Ages, and an interesting case study. It didn't involve a crusade per se, but basically some Normans, Vikings basically, invaded Sicily and set up a kingdom there. And it ended up being a big melting pot, because they're, you know, if you wanted to survive as a small kingdom, you really had to negotiate and have solid diplomatic skills and relations with various Islamic kingdoms. Because the Islamic kingdoms were the heavy hitters of the day. If you want to call those kingdoms, I guess technically they were caliphates or whatever. But you know, Europe was kind of a backwater at that time. It wasn't particularly powerful. So the king of Sicily, as he became, ended up Arabizing somewhat. He ended up learning Arabic. His bureaucrats largely spoke Arabic, and it was an interesting combination. The people of the island were largely, you know, Christian Italian, but there was also a substantial Jewish and Islamic presence. And the bureaucrats, for their part, were largely, if I'm remembering this correctly anyway, Arabs. And then at the very top were the Vikings, you know, the Norman, Scandinavian people, who were kind of the nobles and the, well, the king himself. So yeah, Vikings got around. You know, they got all the way to Newfoundland. Technically, I think they were supposed to be the first Europeans to actually make it to North America. So they were definitely proficient travelers, sailors, soldiers, what have you.
Yeah. It's been a cool kind of, almost like learning about family history for me too after finding out that that's my heritage.
Yeah.
It's pretty barbaric. Like, it's mixed in terms of they did some really cool stuff and left a really big imprint, but they're also, like, pretty savage.
Well, everybody's got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Everybody's got to start somewhere.
I was hoping to hear about Finland during all of this, but I think they were still in the hunter-gatherer stage in this time.
Well, they're not really... they're actually like a whole different thing.
Yeah.
They're not actually Scandinavian, per se. And before any Finns listening to this freak out, don't freak out at me. Because I'm not making this up. I heard what I'm about to say from an actual Finnish person. This was a woman I knew in high school who was, I think, a assistant teacher or something. And she was from Finland. And so I was curious about the world in high school. So, I asked her a bunch of Finland questions. And I also knew a little bit about Finland because I had read about the Winter War, and I was a big hockey fan. There's lots of Finns who play hockey, and there was especially a lot of Finns who played hockey for the Dallas Stars back when I was in high school. So
yep, you're right, Lettinen.
Dang, wow, you knew him.
Yeah, we went to the Stars games, dude.
Nice. Oh, man, I haven't heard that name in a long time. Yeah, Yuri Lettinen, Nico Kapanen back in the day. They had that Joel Lundqvist guy. I think technically Lundqvist was Swedish, though. Anyway. Yeah, I asked her about Finland and whether, is it Scandinavian? What do they have in common with the other Scandinavian countries? And she basically said, yeah, we're not really Scandinavian. We like to think of ourselves as Scandinavian. We want to be Scandinavian, but we're not really. And really the country ethnically speaking, is actually what's called Urguic Altaic, I think. It's sort of a mix between Urguic Altaic and Slavic. Those are the two big cultural and ethnic influences among the Finns. Mm-hmm. And if you don't know what Urguic Altaic is, basically that's like very ancient. Those were cultures and peoples that were in Europe like way before Indo-Europeans, before the Celts. They were like the first dudes there. And they only exist in pretty small pockets. I think Hungary is the other big one. And then I think, I want to say Estonia is the other one. Finland, Estonia, and then Hungary. Although the Hungarians have their own weird Magyar thing going on. That's a whole different tree there. And it's a very strange sounding language. Finnish and Estonian are very different languages, but they're more in roughly the same tree. And it's a completely different tree than the Indo-European. Well, maybe they are in the Indo-European tree. I can't quite remember if it's different than the Indo-European tree or if it's just a very exotic branch of the Indo-European tree. I'm sure there's someone in chat who can kind of clean that up. Maybe now would be the good time for the disclaimer. The usual disclaimer is that I'm not an expert in everything we talk about. I have a stronger background in some things than others. So if I say anything stupid or ignorant or biased, please do contribute in chat. It's meant to be more participatory anyway. It is a conversation. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. So, I'll see the comments. And in any case, I encourage conversation in chat and, people kind of jumping in and giving their perspective, information, opinions, what have you. So now would be a good time for some of that, because I can't quite remember where linguistically Urguic Altaic lay. But Finnish is a weird language, and that's where it is. And it's very, very different than the, what would you call them, Nordic languages in the rest of Scandinavia. They very much have their own thing going on up there. It's a very interesting culture. They have certain similarities with Scandinavia. That's partly because of Swedish influence, probably, because Finland was actually a part of the Kingdom of Sweden for a very long time. That was before the Russian Empire ended up annexing it, and then it was a part of the Russian Empire for, I think, about 100 years. And then they got super lucky with World War I, because Russia just had a catastrophic collapse in World War I, and that gave the Finnish nationalists an opening to declare independence. And then they got super lucky again, because if you notice, a lot of Soviet policy in Europe after World War I kind of centered around regaining the territory Russia had lost before World War I. It's no accident that Russia ended up reacquiring Bessarabia, eastern Poland, the Baltic states. All of that had been former Russian imperial territory. And they didn't end up getting all of it, but they ended up getting a lot of it back. So that was a successful effort on their part. But the Russians never ended up getting Finland back. That's partly because of the Winter War and because they didn't really just see it as being all that worth going after. And it was kind of out of the way. It would have been a lot of trouble to direct a lot of forces up there when they would have rather focused on Nazi Germany. Yeah, Finland in World War II is an interesting case study that has a weird little, largely untold history to it beyond just the Winter War. But yeah, they were fortunate to come out of all that with their independence retained, and they just kind of hung on to it. They had this Finland. The weirdness continued even after World War II. Finland's circumstances in the Cold War were so weird and exotic, it ended up coining its own name in the field of international relations. For a country to be Finlandized is its own concept. That's how unique Finland's diplomatic position was in the Cold War. Like,
nice.
Even during the Cold War, they were weird. But anyway, the point of all that was a little bit different, so it doesn't surprise me that they didn't really pop up in your book much.
But yeah, one thing that kind of comes up with this is that any given population is a mixed bag. Even if you narrow it down to the country, historically, if you go back far enough, it's a very mixed bag. People get around.
Oh yeah.
We're all kind of a hodgepodge mixture of human. So it's fun to kind of have pride in certain things, I guess, but ultimately we're not really that different.
Yeah. Yeah, fundamentally there are more similarities than there are differences in many ways. Certainly as Americans, we see a lot of mixing. We don't complain much. I don't mind all the hot Latinas around. It suits me just fine. Let's see, so what have we got? I've seen a lot... Wait, is that where we were? Yeah. I've seen a lot of mean rhetoric celebrating the death of Senator McCain because people disagreed with him. What do you think this says about the modern political landscape? And is it something we can solve, or is it a fact of human nature?
Can I take a crack at that?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
People are mean, and I haven't seen that, but I believe it because anytime anything happens to anyone, there are going to be some people who want to talk shit, because that's a hobby of a lot of people, is to talk shit. And if you don't like McCain and he died, then you can kind of leave it at that. To talk shit about a dead person is basically trying to rustle the people who thought well of them who are still alive. So that's a pretty key point. It's like McCain doesn't give a shit. He doesn't have the capacity to give shits anymore. So anyone who's talking shit about McCain at this point is basically just trying to upset people who liked McCain in some capacity or feel bad that he died.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a pretty good read.
That's like, I think the technical term in cognitive psychology is schoolyard bullshit. That's just some schoolyard bullshit. People talk shit. Yeah, I mean, if you want to criticize something about him, there's plenty. There's plenty of stuff that you critique and say, he did this wrong, he did that wrong. He talked about this, but he didn't really know what he was talking about. You could do that all day and you would probably be correct, because he did a lot of stuff. A lot of it was probably wrong. But that's just schoolyard bullshit.
I would agree. To build on that, I think it doesn't... To a degree, it reflects the partisanship of the era. But really, I mean, there's always been that. That's not really new. There's always going to be people like that, like you say. I would also add that there's a kind of spectrum of political maturity, you know, and it's not really, it probably correlates strongly with age, but age is no guarantee of political maturity. You know, there are people who are more open-minded, are more tolerant, and are more willing to take a less juvenile approach, shall we say, to, well, shit-talking, I guess, is what I'm getting at. You know, some people just don't do that. Even if they feel strongly about someone who disagrees with them and the politics that person represents or supports, they don't really lower themselves to that level because it's kind of beneath them and they kind of grow out of it. But not everybody does. There are always going to be people at that early stage of political maturity, and I think everybody starts there. It's not unusual. I think everybody starts treating politics more as sport than substance. So there's always going to be people at that level who are thinking in that way, thinking in a way that is conducive to a certain immature and lack of respect in terms of how they approach political opponents of one sort or another.
Yeah, that being said, I think it is fair to have a strong dislike of a given politician. Like, there are certainly plenty of things you could dislike about. Maybe we could say most people in seats of power in politics. But
Oh yeah.
it's really specificity of the actions of the person that put you in the realm where it can be constructive and helpful, as opposed to just general ad hominem of, oh, fuck that guy, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, Trump is someone who I didn't vote for. I do dislike the guy, but to just talk shit about him on the street corner without saying this is a policy that's a problem or this is a behavior that's a problem, and because of this, then we need to do that, which kind of connects back to the political activism problem of it's really hard to get people riled up about specific policy, about actual things that have been passed in Congress. You start saying stuff like Glass-Steagall and the eyes get all kind of hazy and they're like, uh-oh, here comes a bunch of technical terminology and history stuff that I don't care about. I want to cheer. I want to chant something in the street. So it's like trying to be, on the one hand, really rigorous and specific and logical about what you're trying to change in the country, but bearing in mind at the same time, you're trying to change a country built by primates who like to beat their chest and hoot and holler.
Yeah, there is a fundamental tension there between substantive, deep, analytical politics and the need for mobilization. You know, it's all good and well to have a cafe discussion about what policies are best, but if you can't mobilize supporters, it's kind of a dead letter. You know, it doesn't really matter much. But how do you balance those in a way that's at once productive in terms of substantive policy change, but that also is credible in that it can actually get political support broad enough and deep enough to actually give you the votes and power you need to make that policy happen?
Very carefully. That's how you would balance it.
Pretty much. You know, it's a difficult balance to strike. I think it involves coalition building, it involves tolerance, it involves trade-offs, concessions. You know, it involves doing a lot of nitty-gritty backroom dealing type stuff that kind of has a bad name, but is kind of the grease that really makes government and the political machinery of any society function. Let's see. Is it something we can solve? Maybe. I mean, I'm reminded of the Shah of Iran. You know, for those who don't know the Shah of Iran, he was the dictator who ruled Iran after the coup that the U.S. supported in the 1950s. He was already nominally in power before that, but there was also a democratic government, and there was a lot of tension between the democratic government and the Shah about where their respective powers lied. But he ended up being basically absolute dictator after the coup. And his attitude was that development was the most important thing. That was his key item on his political agenda. And his attitude was that Iran could not democratize until everybody had a PhD. Which is a stretch. And I'm sure he was exaggerating a bit. I don't think he literally meant everybody has to have a PhD, but I think he meant we need to reach a certain level of education before it's really feasible for a democratic government to be feasible to work in Iran.
Shoot for the moon and maybe you'll get into orbit.
Yeah, kind of that sort of attitude. But it's just not feasible. You know, I'm sure there are people that would like for the answer to that question, to that problem of how do you resolve sort of hyper-partisanship. I'm sure a lot of people would like the solution to be just advancing people, you know, making them better, you know, sort of ascending human nature from its base roots into something that is more passive, or at least better, you know, that is inherently good. But I don't think that's really possible. obviously there's a whole philosophical discussion about the possibility of changing human nature for the better, but I'm not really of the mind that you can really do it. Certainly, even if you can do it, it's very challenging, and I think that you can't really afford to say no democratization until all of you ascend to a higher plane of understanding. I think that invites a lot of trouble. You know, whether you're we're well intentioned in doing that or not, you're inviting problems because people do not want to wait for that. You know, people think they're entitled to power now, whether they can handle it or not. So unless you're in a society where there's a norm in place that gives the authorities a lot of discretion in determining how much power civilians, the citizenry, if you will, has in decision making, then you really can't just defer handing over power. So certainly in the West, where we are, where it's a very individualistic culture, I don't think you can say we're going to restrict the vote or restrict authority of the ability of the public to participate in decision making until they know better, basically. Until they've reached some arbitrary point of sufficient enlightenment that they can be trusted with the vote. That invites a revolution or violence, some form of instability. It's just not workable. So if you're going to solve it, you're going to solve it from the grassroots up. And we've talked about this before too. Is it better to have a top-down push for reform and social change, or is it better to have a grassroots, bottom-up push for change? And
yes.
It differs, the complex answer kind of gets into, it depends on what kind of change you're looking for and what you're moving. It's a little bit of both, and sometimes it's one or the other depending on the context. But I think in general, you really have to start with the grassroots movement. It's really much better to change society first and then push for real tangible political change than it is to go for political change first without getting that underlying fundamental support that comes from changing society. So it comes down to activists and activism. It comes down to people building support person by person, group by group. It's just a lot of long-term difficult work that's hard to get people excited about, but that is critical to the long-term success of any movement. Talking about mobilizing people, you really can't mobilize a large group of people no matter what if there's not some fundamental basis for broad support. And unless somebody somewhere has laid that groundwork, then it's not really possible for someone later on to take advantage of it and mobilize people into a broad coalition. And maybe you don't necessarily need a lot of groundwork if it happens naturally and organically. It may be that conditions change such that things are so bad or so good that a large group of people within society just sort of naturally change their opinion and represent a natural demographic. But I would argue even then you would need a lot of groundwork and a lot of grassroots operations over a period of time to really make that tangible and malleable. Well, not malleable, but workable. Something that you could work with and mobilize in a tangibly political way. I hope this is making sense. I'm not a poli-sci guy, so this is me trying my best, not speaking from, great authority. And the final part of the question, is it a fact of human nature? You can kind of infer from my answer there that, yeah, I think it is just an inherent part of human nature. People have to grow. Well, not people have to grow, but people change and grow with time. They start at one place, they learn, they get experience, and then they end up at another. And invariably, there are going to be people who move through a stage. At least some people. There's always going to be at least some who move through that stage where they are just belligerent. For some people, it's not even a phase. For some people, it's just their personality. There's such a thing as belligerent people. And sometimes that's a lifelong malady for them. But I think there is just something natural in human nature that produces that phenomena. So let's see. Gary Johnson is running for a Senate seat in New Mexico and apparently has the lead over the Republican candidate, though still behind the Democrat. Is there anything inherent to the modern political landscape that makes this sort of third-party prevalence on the rise? I mean,
Well, don't we have a higher than usual dissatisfaction with Congress in general? So that would mean people are more likely to look for alternatives.
Yeah, I think that's the read there. You know, the structural factors in play are dissatisfaction with Congress and establishment political parties, and that does tend to push more people to third parties. But I don't think third parties will end up gaining any traction from it, and here's why. The way political parties in the United States work is the same way political coalitions work in representative democracies, or parliamentary democracies, depending. And basically what happens in the United States is if an establishment political party starts losing votes to a given ideology or some such, then they just change their platform to try to get those votes back. And that's sort of how the parties change their political position over time. You know, they're slowly responding to stimuli in that vein, and over a long period of time, they end up in different policy positions. And so in this case, the Libertarian candidate is picking up votes, but I suspect if they do well, certainly if they win, then the Republican Party, at least in Arizona, maybe not nationally, but at least in Arizona, would probably change its platform to encompass more libertarian position, such that they would get those votes back. So yes, there are structural factors at play pushing more people towards third parties right now, but those same factors have manifested before in American history, and the long-term effect was not that third parties became mainstream parties, but that one of the two major political parties changed, and it changed their policy position to absorb that political demand represented by that shift towards a third party. And is America in as good of economic shape as Trump is portraying? Definitely not. I mean, it's never as good as any politician will tell you it is. If the economy is doing bad, then politicians will try to make it seem like it, well, it's underperforming, but it's getting better. And if it's doing well, then the politicians will say, oh, it's booming, it's an unprecedented boom, everything is awesome. And if it goes into recession, then they say, oh, this is somebody else's fault. This is the last guy's fault. This isn't me at all. So no, never trust a politician with how you read an economy, for sure. They're the last people you should trust. They have no credibility. Most of them are not economists or have any background with reading an economy anyway. You know, including people with backgrounds in business. People with backgrounds in business can read the economy, but generally they're better at reading specific parts of it, usually the bits that relate to their specific business. It's very difficult to read an economy. You know, there's a whole profession behind that. People get paid to do that, to try to analyze economic data and try to give some overarching impression. In the case of the United States, it's on trend. And that's my understanding of it. Somebody more familiar with the data might be able to get more specific or correct me if I'm wrong on that. But my impression is that since the 2008 financial crisis, the U.S. economy has been trending upward at a pretty steady rate. And there have been periods when there was a sharp downturn. There have been periods where growth was a bit above trend. But overall, it's just kind of a slow recovery. It's slowly recovering and growing from that 2008 financial crisis. And unemployment is really good. I mean, it's very low, but that's bizarre. Nobody can really explain that. I mean, the suspicion is that a lot of it is low-wage labor. There's a lot of low-wage gig economy type work that's absorbing a lot of that. But what that means structurally, because that is a structural change in the economy, what that means for how the economy works and more importantly, how to read economic data, that's a little bit unclear. Because when the fundamentals of an economy change, you kind of need to change the way you read economic data. But because these structural changes to the economy are relatively new and have only played out over the past few decades, we really don't have enough data and information and understanding to know what's happening in the economy. You know, we've talked a bit before about how central bankers around the world are really concerned about this, because they don't really know how to respond to changes in the economy. It's not really clear what they should be doing. You know, historically, if the economy had a downturn, This is the established, status quo knowledge. If the economy has a downturn, you lower interest rates to try to stimulate it back into growth. And if the economy does really well and there's inflation, you raise interest rates, try to slow the economy down and reduce inflation. That's basically central banking in a nutshell. But what do you do if there's a big downturn and there's never really enough of a recovery to justify returning rates to that higher level? Does that mean that lower rates are a new equilibrium, especially if unemployment gets really low? Would that suggest it's just low interest rates are a new equilibrium? Or does that just mean that the economy is sluggish, that it's underperforming, and that the next time there's a crisis, you're not going to have any monetary policy tools to fight it? That interest rates already low can't really be lowered much further, and it'll be just much worse than the previous downturn because you just can't do anything about it, really, at least in terms of monetary policy. That's an open question, and it's kind of an important question because, you don't want the economy to crash and not have any policy tools to do anything about it, but nobody has any data with which to really judge that. So everybody is kind of waiting with bated breath to see what happens. Maybe we'll be fine and it's nothing and we've simply adjusted to a new equilibrium. Maybe the economy explodes. We don't really know. Stay tuned. That'll be fun to find out. Hopefully not the hard way, but that's kind of how you learn things when the very structure of society and economies change. There's not really any data, so you just kind of have to learn the hard way.
On the next episode of Economic Boom or Bust.
Yeah, exactly. So it's hard to tell whether the economy is in really good shape or decent shape or bad shape, or whether it's trending towards a crisis like the Titanic towards a glacier, because of that fact, because of that structural change making it difficult to read data. Given the data we have, and if we use just sort of status quo accepted knowledge basically in the field of economics as I understand it, I'm not a big analytic guy in terms of reading data. I'm not a professional economic forecaster. So make of this what you will. But my understanding is that it's growing at a decent pace, but that it's still not that great. It's not as high as it could be. It's not as high as it was in the 90s. I think at this exact moment, it's actually pretty good. But the consensus seems to be that the reason it's doing very good is because of temporary factors, like the big tax cut, for being the principal example. The big tax cut, some of the deregulation that's happened under the Trump administration, that's created a stimulative effect, but it's a short-term effect. In the medium to long term, economists expect the economy and economic growth to return to trend, and trend growth was relatively low. I think it was somewhere between 1% and 2%, which is not terrible, but not great either. You want more. But again, the fact that unemployment is low is weird. Hypothetically, if the unemployment rate gets this low, there should be a lot of economic growth and rising wages. And we don't really quite see that. And it's a little bit befuddling. And, again, that ties into that conversation about how do you read data in the era of structural change. That probably ties into that somehow. Maybe somebody more up to date on their economic research can give some better insight on that. It's been a few years since I've really dug into academic research. I've been detached from the academia for a while now. But as I understand it anyway, it's kind of mysterious. Mild, decent growth is my short answer to the question. But the more elaborate answer is that it's hard to judge.
Academia is kind of like arcane knowledge.
Well, especially with social science. Because with so much of social science, it's just really hard to establish causality. It's a bit easier with a hard science, because then you can do a more thorough scientific experiment. Whereas with social science, you really can't do an authentic experiment. You really can only do quasi-experiment. You can do experiments that approach scientific experimentation, but that have a lot of weaknesses, and there's just not a lot you can do about that. You can't control the weather, and you can't control people. You can't just control all of the variables that tie into human nature. And if you can't control all the variables, you can't really have a proper experiment, a proper full experiment.
But can't Thor and Zeus control the weather?
Hypothetically, yes. That kind of goes back to the conversation we had about deductive versus inductive reasoning. You know, if you start with the assumption that Thor and Zeus can control the weather, then yes, it makes a lot of sense then that they could do that, and that you could then have an experiment. So I would expect anybody who has a lot of faith in ancient Greek religion to believe that yes, you can have a full experiment in social sciences, and that I'm not quite right on that count. But I don't think there's very many of those people around anymore. I suspect the consensus amongst the broader scientific community is probably on my side on that.
Yeah, well, they just need to use their imagination.
Imagination, the crux of all scientific decision-making. Have you read Super Forecasting / take part in the Good Judgment Project? I haven't ever heard of it. You seem like exactly the type of person written about in that book. No, I have not read the book, but thank you for the recommendation. I will put that in my browser tab to look into later. Harnessing the wisdom of crowds to forecast world events. That's the little Google blurb. That sounds like a decent idea. There's wisdom of crowds seems to have some merit to it. The theory of the wisdom of crowds seemed to have some merit to it, so it's interesting to see somebody, I assume, experiment by seeing what the wisdom of the crowds can generate if you really get a big crowd and subject them to some big questions. But I'm not familiar with the book or the project, so I can't really comment on it. When can we expect the proverbial shit to hit the fan on the issue of fresh water shortages? Which countries are prepared and which are unprepared? Yeah, this is more of an environmental question, and environmentalism and environmental policy specifically is not really my wheelhouse. I would want to look at the literature before giving a concrete, committed answer to that, because I'm sure somebody's written up some forecast as to when we can kind of expect certain regions to start really encountering problems. I know that Cape Town is going to have a problem. Cape Town in South Africa just about ran out of water this past summer. Came pretty dangerously close. So they're probably in trouble, I would expect. Maybe China, because northern China has problems with water shortages right now because it's actually relatively dry. And, you know, that's to say nothing of the problem with desertification they have up there. I don't know if they have it fully under control, but I remember reading that they've taken measures that have been fairly effective. So maybe desertification isn't too much of a long-term problem, but the water shortage remains. There's just too many people for the relatively limited water supplies that are up there. Well, maybe I shouldn't say relatively limited. There's a lot of fresh water in northern China, but when you're dealing with the populations of the scale of China, it's too much. So there's a lot of mega projects in China that are designed to try to divert water from the south of China, where there's a lot more fresh water than in northern China, to try to divert that up north and deal with the water shortage. So on the one hand, they could have a problem in the future, depending on how those projects pan out, but it seems like they're addressing the problem anyway. If India's population growth continues to just go apace, that could be a problem. But I think the projections are that that's going to tail off at some point, once economic growth kind of sufficiently picks up and the country urbanizes. Middle East might have a problem, but, you know, Saudi Arabia already has too many people for the local fresh water sources to kind of provide water for them all. But they get around that by just throwing money at desalinization plants. So long as they've got the money for desalinization, they should be fine. And it may be that desalinization technology, rather, improves over the long term enough to kind of resolve the problem regardless. It just kind of depends on how that pans out. I don't know enough about desalinization technology to know where that's at. For those of you who don't know what desalinization technology is, it occurs to me maybe I should explain it. That's the technology that allows you to convert salt water to fresh water. Or at least that's my understanding of it. So you can't normally drink ocean water because it's got too much salt in it, but if you have a desalinization plant, you can just take water from the ocean, convert it to fresh water, and problem solved. There you go. if the technology can be made cheap enough and efficient enough, you could solve any potential future water crisis, because anybody who runs out of naturally occurring fresh water could just switch over to build desalinization plants and use that instead. But again, I'm not familiar enough with where the technology is or where it's projected to be to really make a good prediction on that. But that is an important variable to consider there. There are parts of the American West that are very dry, certainly in Nevada, for example. Nevada, Arizona, that area was never intended. Well, let me put it like this. It does not have the natural resources to really prop up large populations. You know, it was all originally basically a big desert. And what kind of facilitated the growth of cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas was the Hoover Dam, which created, for one, an electricity source, but also a huge reservoir of water that could be used to provide the water supplies needed for large cities to grow in the region. But we're kind of reaching critical mass over there. That's getting to be a problem. So it's maybe another 20 years or so, and that's going to kind of get tapped out, and they're going to have to start thinking about some mega projects of their own to divert water from other areas. The Great Plains already has a problem. Farmers on the Great Plains have been overly dependent on the, I think it's called the Ogallala Aquifer. Not sure how to pronounce that. But basically, they've been depending on water that's underground in an aquifer, and that's getting low. That's not going to last too much longer in the grand scheme of things, like decades, measured in decades, that is to say. But when that's out, they're going to have a problem, because that's kind of a naturally dry region, so it's not real great for agriculture. Not clear how they'll resolve that particular problem either. But the full honest short answer is, I don't know. I don't know enough about where the science on water and water usage is at to really give a really good answer to that. But those are some examples I can think of places that could have a problem in future and what they're doing about it. What do you think about age and or term limits for Congress? Yeah, term limits get thrown around a lot as a solution, but I don't think it would really make a difference. I don't think it would make a dent. Because the problem is a problem with political culture. It's a problem with people getting too ambitious, people putting their ideology and ambitions ahead of the common good, ahead of democratic norms, institutional norms. And that's not a problem that term limits are going to solve. In fact, it could possibly make them worse. Nominally, the idea behind term limits is that you can't run for Congress beyond 2 terms. If you win a seat in Congress and then you win another seat, then depending on how the rules are written, you would not be able to run again if it was limited to 2 terms. So hypothetically, if you have no real prospect of running for Congress forever and ever and always having that as your job, then you don't have as much of an incentive to be corrupt, because you can't really build up a lot of seniority, you can't build up a lot of connections, you can't be a career politician. So hypothetically, that would limit political competition to people who are earnestly interested in the issues, political issues of the day, rather than looking to build a political career. Now, the flip side of that is if you win office and you know you're not going to run for re-election, what's your incentive to give a shit? You don't really have one. Short of a recall petition by your constituents, if you know you can't run for re-election, then you can just kind of do whatever the hell you want. And so long as it's not too crazy, you'll be fine. So there is an accountability issue there. That's sort of the common counter-argument to term limits. There's not as much voter accountability if you limit politicians in how many terms they can serve. So that's kind of the downside. Really, whether or not people want or need term limits, for that matter, just comes down to their own individual preferences or regional preferences or particular problems. If you're having a problem with career politicians staying in office forever and not being sufficiently accountable, then yeah, have some term limits, implement that. You can help put a dent in that, and it'll help probably change that particular aspect of the political culture. But in the United States, the problem is overarching. You know, the problem is much bigger than just people being career politicians. In fact, I would go so far as to argue that one of the problems, if not the problem in Washington right now, is too many Mr. Smiths and not enough Washington. There's too many ideologues who are driven by passionate ideology, winning office and getting into Washington, who don't really understand how real politics work, who don't understand how real policy making, how real compromise is supposed to function as a mechanism of policy making. That's my personal read, though. Make of that what you will. Obviously, different people will have different reads on what's wrong, so to speak, with American political culture. But I don't think there's anything wrong, broadly speaking, with the problems faced in U.S. politics that term limits for congressmen will solve. Again, not to say they won't solve any problems or that they won't solve a particular area's problems, you know, in which case, by all means, implement them. But the idea that we're a term limit reform away from having decent, effective politics is not accurate, in my opinion. As for age limits, it's kind of the same deal. I mean, similar mechanics are in play. You know, if you know that you can't get reelected because you're approaching that age ceiling, then you can kind of just do whatever, and that may or may not be a good thing, depending on what kind of crazy shit you want to try. And in some cases, it's the older folks who are wiser, and yeah, this is sort of the traditional argument for older politicians.
Respect your elders.
Yeah, basically. You know, they're more experienced, they know how things work, and they know how to get things done. So nominally, that would be one argument against age restrictions. You know, you're just kind of by implementing an age restriction, you may be restricting yourself to the less experienced alternatives to the more experienced politicians. But on the other hand, maybe it's the older politicians who are screwing you over, in which case, yeah, maybe not a bad idea. It depends on context, I think. I think any given policy, in order to really judge it effectively, you have to consider its context, its costs, and its benefits. And you have to weigh all of those against each other and make some kind of judgment call. And if you judge, given the costs, benefits, and context, that it's worth it, do it. If not, don't do it. But I think you have to do that for everything. I don't think there's any real blanket generalization you can make. There is no grand policy solution or simple policy solution that's going to kind of deal with a lot of the big sweeping issues that frequently people ask about. Or even really narrow specific issues. I mean, some of the narrow specific issues can be devilishly difficult in their own right because you have to get so specific in targeting them. Sometimes you just don't have the tools to target that precisely. But anyway, that's roughly what I think of them, of what I think of age and term limits. Let's see, I am born and raised Cuban. Cuba has been a communist country for nearly 70 years. I have been legally living in the US for a very long time. Needless to say, I believe communism is cancer, and I hate it. In the last few years, I've noticed a lot of the new US young people believe socialism is a good thing, and would vote for a socialist president candidate. Do you see the US becoming communist in the future? No, I don't. That's the short answer. Highly unlikely. Because we have a very strong, healthy, political conservative right in the US. And it's very virulent. It's very potent, politically speaking. So I think they would stop any such lurch to the left. And if there were such a lurch to the left anyway, that would probably precipitate some kind of low-intensity conflict. And that would probably have enough broad support to prevent any real communist takeover or establishment of an actual communist government in the United States. So, no, I don't think the United States is in much danger of that, if only for that reason.
Well,
you know, conservatism.
To use an analogy for it is moving the political orientation of an entire country is more like a glacier moving than like a transformative experience of all of a sudden they went super far to the left. Mm-hmm. Because the people who are really in any position are invested in that position, so they're in trenches. So it's kind of like trench warfare, debating whether or not the right or the left is correct relative to some country's politics. So people don't want to exit the trench that they've already dug for themselves and just hop in the next one over. It would be, it would take something really drastic and unprecedented for that to happen. It's not like you're suddenly at risk of totally flipping.
Yeah, I would agree. That's my judgment as well. It's just too big a jump. And keep in mind, the United States is the size of a continent. So we have big regional differences in political preferences. And there are big swaths of the United States that are very conservative and have no patience for, well, you could argue no patience for leftist politics in general, in some cases, let alone far left politics like communism. So certainly those regions are not on board with any communist government of any kind. To kind of get to the crux of the question, young people in the United States have always leaned left, and in particular to socialism. That's not unusual. That goes back many, many decades. In particular the 1960s, when there was a big, not a cultural revolution per se, but the counterculture, and there was a significant amount of social change that came out of the 1960s. And part of that was turning on the establishment, which was in general more democratic and capitalist. And so there was an embrace then of more socialist ideologies and alternative ideologies in general. Libertarianism and socialism in the United States owe a lot to the 1960s. Obviously, socialism predated the 1960s. But the 1960s really changed the face of socialism in the United States and gave it new energy and a different tenor. It gave it a new role in society that it hadn't really had before. You could argue it's a less potent, politically effective role, but certainly it changed it. But it's not unusual for kids in the United States to identify more. In general, younger people are leftist, and then the older people the more they trend to the right. I think Tracy Ullman released a really funny video to that effect recently. It was a short. It was like a comedic skit, basically, but she basically made that point in the skit. Pretty funny. So yeah, I wouldn't. If you're worried about it, don't worry about it. Or at least I would not worry about it, because that's just a trend, and I don't see it trending greater. I don't see relatively more young people in the United States becoming more socialist with time than any previous generation. Socialism as an ideology is becoming accepted. That's true. But I would argue that's almost more a return to mean, so to speak. Because it used to be socialism was a political force in the United States. Obviously it varied from region to region and how successful it was, but the name itself was not a dirty word, like it became during the Cold War. So I would argue we're just kind of getting more back to that. And that kind of leads into another conversation about what's happening to the United States, how is the United States changing, why is it changing, and what's it changing into, etc. And a lot of my answers to that, or at least a potential answer to that I've contrived, this is kind of me theorizing and playing on my own time with different answers, but you could color a lot of the changes that have been happening to the United States politically, economically, and socially over the past few decades, not as a revolutionary change or a new direction in history, but rather a return to mean. Returning to what the United States was before World War II. There's a lot of parallels between the modern U.S. and the pre-war United States, and it's kind of interesting to see how the United States, in many ways, is just becoming more like that, returning to that form, rather than just becoming something completely new. We can talk about that sometime if somebody wants. Again, like I said, I haven't super fleshed out that idea, but there are parallels there to kind of support some of it. There is some evidence to that effect. Let's see. Will the U.S. government or any other government ever disclose the information they have on intelligent extraterrestrial biological entities, aka aliens? Probably not, because I don't think they have any. I doubt there is any. If they do, they'll probably release it much, much later. I think I read recently that the autopsy report for Elvis is not supposed to be released until like 2035 or something like that. So it may be that there is information to the effect that maybe there's evidence for extraterrestrials, but that the government has it classified for the next, umpteen dozen years or however long, and so we may none of us listening now, none of us alive now may be around for when those get declassified. But I think if there really were substantive evidence of alien life, it probably would have been released. So if you're worried about lizard people, I would say don't sweat it. You can take off the glasses, so to speak. And points to anybody who gets that reference, because that's an old one, but a good one. Let's see. Have you heard of the Chinese naval base in Djibouti? Yep. Any thoughts as to why China would pick that particular location to expand their sphere of influence? I don't think they picked it to expand their sphere of influence, because Djibouti is a piss poor place to pick if you're looking to expand your sphere of influence. Djibouti was chosen because that's a center for international anti-piracy operations. The U.S. Navy, the French Navy, the British Navy, and a whole bunch of other navies in the region operate out of bases in Djibouti, because that's right next to the areas that suffer most from piracy in that region. And so everybody and their mother comes there. And Djibouti is an ideal location because it's a relatively stable country economically and politically. And it's been very receptive to requests to host naval bases to that effect. Somalia is a mess. Eritrea is a bit of a mess. Kind of an authoritarian, closed-off mess. Different kind of mess than Somalia, but still problematic. And Yemen is a mess. And Saudi Arabia, maybe not that receptive to having a bunch of foreigners run around. So that kind of leaves Djibouti as the natural choice. There's not really anywhere else to go. So I don't think the Chinese are there for expanding influence. I think they wanted to participate in the anti-piracy operation, which was, the actual reason given and what they've been doing. And Djibouti was the only rational choice. I mean, especially given that the anti-piracy operation was already based out of Djibouti. If China wanted to participate, that was invariably where they were going to go. And I don't think the Chinese have been doing anything untoward in Djibouti. I don't think, anything like malign influence peddling or, manipulating politics in Djibouti or the region or any of that. So near as I can tell, it's a legit anti-piracy operation. It does give them a platform from which to project influence in the region that they did not have before. That may be a secondary reason they did it, probably. But they haven't been doing much to that effect, at least not yet. And right now it's been pretty exclusively focused on anti-piracy. More to the point, and the reason I say it's a piss-poor place to expand your influence is because everybody else is already there. So if you do decide to start shit of some kind in the region, you're going to be doing it with all of your natural rivals right next to you. Like, they're all right there. Like, we see what you're doing. Like, you can't hide it. Like, we're totally onto you. You're not fooling anybody.
I'm sorry, Twitch chat is too immature for you to be saying Djibouti just willy-nilly like this.
Well, maybe I should call it French Somaliland. Would that be better?
Djibouti is correct, so on the one hand I'm thinking, call it what it is. It's called Djibouti. But, yeah, I mean, it's a bunch of young people all riled up now. Just keep saying Djibouti.
Well, it is the internet.
It is the internet.
I accept that going in, that's going to happen, so it doesn't bother me. That's the risk you take on the internet. That's what you can expect. But yeah, I mean, it used to be French Somaliland. It used to be a French territory. In fact, the French still have like a full-on base there. A lot of the bases that have been set up in Djibouti are just small, minor anti-piracy, international operations type bases. But the French and I think the United States are the two countries that have actual independent, autonomous bases in Djibouti. And that relationship that what used to be called French Somaliland had with France is the reason they still have influence there. I think you could probably say even that Djibouti is a part of Francafrique, which is sort of the generic name that French people came up with to describe France's sphere of influence in Africa. But that's my reading of it anyway. That's my impression. I don't think you would count that as part of China expanding its influence. I think a better argument would be made for the port in Sri Lanka, and that's generally what people have been focusing in on. in Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan government took a big loan from a Chinese development bank. I think I tripped over myself a week or two ago trying to remember the two major development banks that China started. I think one of them was the China Development Bank, and then another one was the more recent one that everybody, Asian Development Bank. I still need to look that up. I think I did look it up, but then immediately forgot, which tells you something about my memory. But anyway, I think in Sri Lanka, the government took on a lot of debt to develop a new port using Chinese investing, or rather money borrowed from a development bank. And it ended up being too much. The government could not pay back the loan. The interest payments were too large. And so as part of the settlement, the Sri Lankan government basically leased that port to a Chinese company. It may have been the development bank or a different development company that was involved in the operation. And so a lot of people said, oh, that's China's strategy. You know, they argued that China is going out of its way to saddle developing countries with loans so that they can later on get concessions when they fail to repay those loans. I don't really invest much in that argumentation, though, because I think, like I argued last week, I think we did talk about this last week, if a country does not want to lease land or territory, or even just doesn't want to pay back China, there's not nearly as many consequences for doing so as if you did that with the Western financial system. Because with Western financial entities or development banks or what have you, there's a lot more punishment that can be brought down on you. Whereas with China, their financial system is not as big, and China has fewer policy tools to bring to bear, especially against countries that are much further from China and have weaker links. But Sri Lanka is generally the example brought up as the best case study, as the strongest case study for China influence peddling in the region. Let's see. So then, do you have any thoughts on the current U.S.-North Korea situation? What do you feel is the best course of action to deal with the massive hole that Trump has dug himself into? North Korea now has a massive amount of leverage on Trump and has consistently been making a fool out of him since the Singapore summit. Curious on any of your thoughts on the situation. A lot of subjective judgments in this question. Yeah, it has not gone according to plan. I think that much can be said for on the part of the Trump administration. You know, they probably were really counting on the carrot and stick approach being effective, but it hasn't really worked out that way. You know, I think North Korea notes the escalation in the economic tension between China and the U.S. and sees that as an opportunity to get away with more, to continue development of at least its ballistic missile program, if not also the nuclear program. Because they think that the Chinese, or more accurately, the Chinese government, will want to use North Korea as a bargaining chip in those economic trade negotiations. And so if there is less progress in those trade negotiations, and maybe that North Korea feels that it has more of a free hand to cause trouble, because that makes them as a bargaining chip more powerful and bigger to the Chinese in that other trade negotiation. So it may be that so long as the United States is really pushing hard on China on the economic front, they're going to have to lose ground on the strategic North Korea front. On the other hand, they could give concessions to China economically, and then in that way get their support to put more pressure on North Korea in order to get more progress there. I don't think the U.S. can have its cake and eat it too. And so long as North Korea doesn't do anything overtly stupid, like continue testing nuclear weapons, the Chinese really did not like that. So long as they don't do something like that that aggravates their Chinese partner, then I think the North Koreans can count on Chinese support. And so long as that's the case, I think they have a strong enough partner to kind of thumb their nose at the United States. I think that was the big reason for Kim Jong-un's trip to Beijing before the summit with Donald Trump. They were probably trying to work out a common strategy for how to deal with Trump and trying to work out what the Chinese thought would be acceptable for the North Korean government to do, what they did not think would be acceptable, etc. Basically just fleshing out the alliance and reinvigorating it. So long as North Korea stopped testing nuclear weapons and did not exhibit great ambition, basically, to become a great nuclear power, and probably made some secret concessions of some sort. They may have promised to Xi Jinping that they would not develop full capacity, fully capable nuclear weapon. So there may be some secret arrangement there that alleviated Chinese concerns about North Korea's nuclear program, such that the Chinese government was okay taking pressure off them and focusing more on the trade negotiation with the United States. And if that's true, then the U.S. is going to have a problem. Because China's a strong partner for North Korea, it has. And so long as they've got Chinese support, there's not a whole lot they can do. I mean, you could launch unilateral airstrikes, but China will just throw their weight behind North Korea, and North Korea will just start rebuilding their nuclear program. So unless your airstrikes are so accurate and destructive and cataclysmic for the nuclear program that they just can't continue it and have to start from scratch, then unilateral airstrikes are not going to be able to accomplish much, at least over the long term. And more to the point, I don't think the United States has the intelligence it would need to have the strikes be sufficiently destructive to be anything other than suboptimal. Maybe they do and I'm wrong, in which case that changes the calculus, but my impression is that the North Koreans have gone out of their way to hide and distribute their nuclear program such that it's, specifically so that it's difficult to destroy or significantly dismantle or disrupt with airstrikes. They're not dumb. They've known airstrikes have been coming in some form. They've assumed that at some point airstrikes would be coming at some point in the future. So they've gone out of their way to fortify various facilities and whatnot, command and control centers, etc., in preparation for that. So one of the reasons they built all those tunnels under the DMZ. Have you heard about those, Neuro?
Nope.
Well, over the course, of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, maybe probably before that even, and probably still now, the North Korean government dug tunnels under the DMZ into South Korea. And some of them were just meant to infiltrate people into South Korea, intelligence agents, spies, what have you. But some of them were just really huge tunnels that were designed for use by the military. Like if there were an actual resumption of the Korean War that never technically ended, so it would be a resumption and not a second Korean War, they would be able to send maybe whole armored divisions through these big tunnels they dug and just have them pop up. Have them pop up behind lines in South Korea.
Surprise!
Or at least yeah, big surprise. But at least that's what they would have done if we hadn't found out about them. So, of course, those have all been filled in. But who's to say they may have dug new ones? You never can tell with North Korea. But they're very proficient, basically, at tunneling underground and hardening facilities underground because of the U.S. advantage in air power. Which makes me think that unilateral airstrikes against the nuclear program would probably not be entirely effective, and may just embolden them to do more, given that it might elucidate. Elucidate's not the right word. Given that it might make the Chinese throw their weight behind North Korea even more, and make them even more of a belligerent, make their diplomatic relations even more belligerent than they were before, possibly introducing even more instability on the peninsula than there was before. It's a delicate game, and it's not really being played by particularly delicate players at the moment. And I don't mean to rag on Trump when I say that, because that also goes for Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un. Probably less so Xi Jinping. He's a little more calculating, but even he's playing a difficult game. He kind of has the tiger by the tail right now in China. Everybody kind of respects him and gives him a lot of deference because he's at the top of the pyramid. I think somebody in chat last week made a great joke in reference to Afro Samurai and said that Xi Jinping has the #1 headband in the Chinese Communist Party. That's very accurate. That's very accurate. But, having the #1 headband means that everybody's after you. So that's why I say he has the tiger by the tail. He's on top right now, but if he slips even a little bit, he's going to get eaten. So we'll see how that all plays out in terms of the North Korea negotiations and the trade negotiations between the U.S. and China. I'm sure the negotiating parties involved will resolve it with their characteristic grace and humility. Let's see, I'm curious about the state of the land affecting the development of Djibouti. I know a lot of developing nations that have to deal with tidal waves or tornadoes suffer from slow development, and Djibouti has had a lot of earthquake activity. So do you think that they can thrive despite this, or will they be held back by Djibouti? Will they be held back by those factors? No, I don't think so, because, you know, there are lots of examples of countries developing even in the face of difficult natural disasters, or at the risk of natural. You know, Japan is on the Ring of Fire, and they've had some very destructive earthquakes in their time, so, but they've still managed to become a fully developed country. You know, and trying to think of something more along the equator. That's a whole other discussion, though. that whole global north versus global south bullshit is its own discussion. But yeah, I think Djibouti can overcome those restrictions and what would you call them, disadvantages. The problem in Djibouti is not so much the natural disadvantages. The problem is more development, rule of law, strong institutions, or more accurately, weak institutions. Political corruption. I think they've technically been governed by one party for a very long time now. It's not as bad a one-party rule as certain other places, but, you know, one-party rule definitely introduces great temptation for corruption and abuse of power, none of which is particularly good for economic development. You know, I think Djibouti has been leaning really heavily on the international military missions to help their development. You know, there's so many soldiers and international missions and bureaucrats and all that kind of come and go, that itself acts as a pretty substantial economic stimulus in Djibouti. But it's kind of like tourism, you know, it's a very transient form of economic stimulus, and it's not really a good way over the long run to generate economic growth. You know, if you're going to develop a modern economy, you do need to move at some point beyond just tourism or military bases or what have you. What you really want is something that's sustainable over the long run. And generally that means moving up the value chain, having more educated, skilled workers, doing more skilled type labor of one sort or another, you know, high value production of goods, high productivity jobs, things like that. That's more the direction you want to go. And I don't get the impression that the Djiboutian government, I guess is what you would call it, that the Djibouti government is moving in that direction, is implementing the necessary policy reforms to really make that happen. So that's more the crux of their development difficulties, I would imagine, more so than tornadoes, earthquakes, what have you. It doesn't help that it's in a very difficult neighborhood. You know, there's political risk gets factored into investment decision making amongst big investors, and you know, when your neighbors are Somalia and Eritrea, investors get nervous. that represents risk, to say nothing of the piracy problem. So location also isn't helping them. Let's see. The final question we have was, what will happen to Julian Assange? I have no idea. I assume he's still holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Maybe he'll just stay there. Maybe he'll just be there forever. There'll just be sort of this curiosity 50 years from now in the Ecuadorian embassy. Maybe they'll just build a wing for him. A little museum dedicated. I really don't know. It's hard to say. I think there was a push to try to get him the hell out, because there was a new government in Ecuador that replaced the Correa government with, I don't remember the new guy's name, but the new guy was not as high on Julian Assange, or the fact that he was eating up space in their embassy. So I think there was kind of a push to get him out. They restricted his internet access, and I think they did some other little things. But I don't think they're going to, it didn't seem like they were going to push him out, and they haven't since then. So presumably they're going to keep him on. I don't know what happens with that, because I think the British are still trying to arrest him. It's not for the Swedish thing anymore, though. I think it's more evasion, whatever the British equivalent is for running. I forget the technical name for it. They can arrest you for not obeying the police and surrendering when you're basically asked to surrender when they try to arrest you, and Julian Assange did not do that. So I think there could be charges on that count. There's also, supposedly, he could be extradited to the United States. We might be detained on that account and later extradited. I don't really know what they would get him for. Presumably somebody in chat knows. because I'm sure they're more somebody is held down to be more up to date on him than I am. I don't follow him much because he's not really big news. You know, WikiLeaks has outgrown him. As an institution, WikiLeaks doesn't really need Julian Assange. It's continued to operate and function without his input. Some would argue it's in a branch of the Russian intelligence. Others would argue that it's a legitimate whistleblowing website. I won't tell you what to believe on that count. That's up to individual preference. You know, people have to judge the evidence for themselves on that. But I think regardless, it's pretty clear that it's succeeding and thriving without him. And given that that was his claim to fame, I just don't really invest much in following him. Like, even if you did arrest him, what does that change? What's he going to do?
Symbolism.
Yeah, I guess there is something to be said for that. There is that symbolism.
People
kind of
love
going
symbolism,
after
dude.
I remember people in the United States saying that he should be tried for treason. He's a traitor. Presumably these people were not aware that he was not an American citizen. So let's see, that's all we had for questions.
He's Australian, right?
I believe so, yeah. I believe he is an Australian citizen.
Wow.
Yeah, those Australians, they're adventurous. You can see that with their government recently. They had another putsch. Turnbull is out. I think they've had a different prime minister every year for the past 4 or 5 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it used to be Italy was known for having inconsistent government. It seems Australia has taken up the habit. We'll see how that pans out. It kind of illustrates, though, that I guess parliamentary democracies are not inherently more stable than what we have here in the U.S. Not, what would you call the U.S. electoral system? First past the post, I guess. But a parliamentary system actually also can have first past the post. The UK and Australia and Canada, I think, all do that. But the point is, just because you have a system like that doesn't inherently mean it's more stable. You know, the same political and social tensions that create instability in American politics and the American political / electoral system, those can play out just as strongly in other political systems and cause just as much dysfunction. It might be that you can change the electoral system in a given country to try to mitigate some of that dysfunction, but you know, fundamentally there's no cure-all for it. Ultimately, how you want to reform an electoral system comes down to preference. What kind of electoral system would you prefer, and what do you want it to look like? What kind of politics and what kind of systems and mechanisms would you like? Would you be more comfortable with? That's generally what discussions about electoral systems kind of comes down to. Certainly some are stronger than others objectively. But sometimes when you get down to some that are very similar but kind of differ only in minor mechanics, a lot of that comes down to just preference. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. What was the topic? Oh, Australia. Talking about Australia. Yeah, that's a little bit dysfunctional right now in Australia because there's all this infighting within not just the Conservative Party, but in different turns also the left political party. I guess the Labour Party is what you would call that in Australia. Yeah, one guy gets in, and then he gets stabbed in the back by somebody else, and then the old guy wants revenge, and so they kind of go back and forth. There's a lot of, what would you call it, House of Cards style politics in Australia over the past few years. It doesn't help that there's a lot of dissent within Australia. There's a lot of thorny political, social issues going on, you know, race, Chinese influence, the economy. You know, lots of stuff like that is, and you know, they're also subject to the populist wave that everybody else in the world has been subjected to. So all of that is creating different political forces that are in their competition with each other, creating churn and making it difficult for anything to get done. There's been some specific recommendations on systematic changes, you know, fundamental changes to the political system that might mitigate some of that, basically geared towards making it more difficult to overturn a sitting government within a political party, raising the threshold of votes needed, that kind of thing. But that wouldn't really deal with like the fundamental differences in policy, etc. Doesn't bother me as an American. You know, the idea that a political party should be able to force everybody who's a member into lockstep on policy doesn't really sit well with my American libertarian instincts. And I say that not as a libertarian because I'm a libertarian, just as an American. Most Americans would not be comfortable with a political party having that degree of authority.
Well, the thing that really gets our spirits all whipped up in a frenzy is individual liberty. Mm-hmm. And if you have the politicians forced to do something to be a part of a party, that's a very offensive concept to us. So whatever your affiliation, I think Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians all agree. We want people thinking for themselves, and anything that's too team-oriented like that, which in other cultures that might be fine. If you're in more of a collectivist culture, then doing what the party wants could be seen as virtuous. So it's kind of relative to your perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly it.
But it's a very un-American one.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's a very individualistic culture here. And really, we're just so big a country that you kind of do need a lot more decentralization anyway. So it really kind of fits the large circumstances geographically and in terms of diversity of politics and social background that we have here. And it's just better for mobilizing the grassroots. It gets people more involved, you know. I'm sure a lot of foreigners give us shit here for our primary system, but it does give the benefit of giving the public more of a voice in party decision-making beyond just a tiny elite at the top of the party. We still have that here, too. There are definitely party elites that have disproportionate voice, but it's not nearly to the same degree as in places like Europe or Australia or what have you, where parties are much more centralized within themselves. I think France experimented with primaries recently. No, not France. It was the Conservative political party in France had an experiment in which they allowed primaries for the first time, but before the recent election that saw Macron win, or Macron, or however it is you pronounce that. I get some cheap laughs from some French people, I think, because I mispronounce his name every time. But yeah, they tried it, and meh. I mean, on the one hand, yes, it was great to have the people have a direct vote, but the candidate they ended up getting was not super inspiring. You know, it ended up being a surprise candidate. I think it was Nathan Fillion is the actor, isn't he? Well, it sounded like Nathan Fillion. I think the guy they nominated for the party. I think they even changed their name to Republican Party.
You just gotta put the French jazz on it. Nathan Fillion.
There you go.
Now it's a French name.
But yeah, he wasn't terribly inspiring, and in general, the Republicans and the whatever the left party in France is called these days, neither one of them had much support. And there was a big populist upturn in France, you know, like everywhere else. So they ended up on the getting outed by the new guy, the fresh face. Even Macron didn't get a whole lot of support. I mean, he had a strong wave backing him for sure. But there was also a lot of people that just didn't turn up to vote because they didn't like any of the options. Yeah, that's one of the big challenges Macron faces in France, is trying to mobilize enough political support from erstwhile political opponents. People who don't really have enough popularity themselves to actually run the government, but who don't like what he's proposing. So they kind of stonewall. People on right and left do that, not only in France, but everywhere else. Kind of one of the defining aspects of this particular era of history. Let's see. So we got two more questions. As a follow-up to the North Korea stuff, what do you feel about Moon Jae-in's position specifically? He's still continuing to push inter-Korea talks in a very sunshine policy-like manner, trying to prioritize peace on the peninsula, even with Kim Jong-un continuing with nuclear production. Is this a correct path? For those who don't know, the Sunshine Policy is what is a policy that was propagated 10, 15 years ago under a previous left-center South Korean administration that wanted to butter up to the North Korean government. I really need to get the colloquialisms under control. That must be super confusing for some people. To get on better relations with North Korea. This particular South Korean government wanted better relations with North Korea. And so they did a lot of little things, a lot of symbolic things to try to improve relations, try to de-escalate tensions. That's what the Sunshine Policy basically refers to. And so the new president of South Korea has taken a similar tract. All of the testing of nuclear weapons kind of ended that. Well, not completely ended it, but it certainly curtailed it. And South Korea kind of fell into line with the United States in pressuring North Korea on its nuclear weapons program. Although the South Korean government definitely had qualms about the prospect of unilateral American military action. They were clearly not really on board with that. Not that there was much they could have done, but they voiced concern on that count anyway. But since the Singapore summit, South Korea has been kind of returning to the Sunshine Policy more, and there have been more meetings, and I think the past week or two there was family reunions, which is always a big deal in South Korea. People separated on different sides of the DMZ by the Korean War. A lot of the families separated by the DMZ after the Korean War often didn't get to see each other for decades and decades. And so the very rare family reunions allowed by the North Korean government and South Korean government, those are big deals for those people, obviously. There's not as many of those people around anymore because that was a long time ago, and there's not very many people alive during that period. Now, a lot of families, if not most families, don't have people really on the other side of the DMZ, or that motivated to go seek them out for a family reunion of some sort or another. But nominally, that's been the kind of symbolic action that's been taken to try to kind of get the North Korean government to behave better and improve relations. As far as I know, yeah, the South Korean government is still doing that, but the effectiveness is questionable. It's not clear if it's actually going anywhere. Obviously, there's a lot of concern that the North Korean government is still working on certain programs, nuclear, ballistic missile. So clearly, Sunshine Policy isn't working on that count. But if they're just doing it to de-escalate tension, you could argue that's been more fruitful. Yeah, the South Korean government in general is not interested in really aggressive actions to try to coerce the North Korean government into stopping its nuclear weapons program. Their bag has been more some pressure, but then also incentives. That's more the path they want to take. And they'll probably be about as effective in doing that as anything else anybody's done with North Korea. In other words, not very. North Korea has proven that it pretty much does whatever the hell it wants to. The North Korean government will get away with whatever it can get away with and nothing less. That seems to be their foreign policy strategy. So I don't think it really matters that much if the South Korean government gets really bombastic or gets really friendly or just gets apathetic. I mean, none of it really seems to have a big effect one way or the other on North Korean behavior. North Korean behavior has been pretty consistent in that regard. So maybe it's good politics in South Korea. In that sense, it might be good for them. But in terms of influencing North Korea, I don't really think it'll have much in the way of results. I'd have very low expectations, basically. Again, not necessarily a bad idea, because there's not really any good options. So if you have to choose from a bunch of options you think are going to be ineffective, pick the one you like the best. What else can you do?
Well, it seems like in simple terms, should we be tough with them and mean to them? Okay, that didn't work. Should we be really nice to them for no reason? Okay, that didn't work either.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Anyone else who has an idea, go for it.
Yeah. And right now the guy in power has the idea that maybe if they're nice, then that'll help. But it's just an idea, and I think even within their administration, they don't really have high expectations. I think it kind of, for the South Korean government, I think relations with North Korea come down to managing uncertainty and risk. So more risk-averse administrations in South Korea have generally been nicer to North Korea and taken a more conciliatory approach. And more risk-tolerant administrations have been more willing to confront them and take a more confrontational approach generally. So in that sense, the approach South Korea takes is not so much about North Korea as it is about South Korean political preferences. Let's see. So roughly, that's my read on that. Next question was: South America still holds anti-imperialist ideals. Do you think there will be a backlash when the UN takes action in Venezuela? I can just about guarantee that the UN will not take action in Venezuela. They're not going to do a goddamn thing. The UN was not built to do that. Somebody would veto it for sure in the Security Council, and they would. Whoever did would probably get a lot of support from South America. Because, like you say, South America is not interested in foreign intervention, like, at all. Even amongst American allies, there's a lot of resistance to the idea of foreign intervention, and that's been true even at the hottest points of the Cold War. Even at those points, South America had to be poked and prodded into supporting anything that even resembled foreign intervention, especially in South America. Well, Latin America generally. So it'll probably get vetoed. And I don't think it would even come up in the first place, because Venezuela is very politely focusing on repressing their own people, not really invading their neighbors or any such. Certainly that it's affecting their neighbors. There is a bit of a embryonic growing refugee crisis emanating from Venezuela, but it's not strategic. It's not like they're doing it on purpose. It's not a concerted campaign to destabilize their neighbors. You know, so long as Venezuela keeps their army within Venezuela's, I don't think the UN Security Council is going to get a vote on it. They're going to do anything about it. Now, the Organization of American States, on the other hand, that's different, because the OAS has a somewhat different set of criteria for determining what constitutes a threat and what actions can be taken. But I think even there, as a regional organization dedicated to regional security, among other things, even in that case, I don't think there would be enough support for intervention, because again, a lot of Latin American countries are very resistant to foreign intervention, and I don't think the crisis in Venezuela, however you want to read that, repression or the refugee crisis or the economic crisis or what have you, I don't think it's reached significant enough proportions to warrant foreign intervention, at least proportionate enough to convince Latin American nations that intervention would be justified. So even in the OAS, I don't think you'd have the vote. And again, I don't think it would even really come up. The United States could make it come up, they could present it, but they wouldn't have the votes to back it. So I don't think that would go anywhere. Yeah, I just don't see a war with Venezuela happening. The crisis is just too self-contained. I mean, there might be if Venezuela were doing more to invite foreign military powers into Venezuela. Like if Venezuela were saying, you know, Russia or China can have a base and deploy large numbers of troops in Venezuela. That would be different. That would be a shitstorm. You can for sure bet the CIA would be all over them if that were the case, and there probably would be either direct or indirect intervention in that case. But that's not what's happened. You know, they've been very contained. You know, they talk a lot of smack about the United States and American allies in the region, like Colombia, what have you, but beyond that, they just really haven't done much of substance that could be construed as a real threat to American interests in the region. I mean, I guess you could say they've been nationalizing American property in Venezuela, and that's not good, but I don't really see, you know, the nationalization of a Kellogg cereal factory as constituting grounds for an intervention. So I think they're pretty safe in terms of foreign intervention. You know, and frankly, they're a danger more to themselves than they are to anybody else at this point. So anybody who wanted intervention would be hard-pressed to justify it. Yeah, just so long as they stay self-contained and they don't start interacting too much with extra-hemispheric powers, they'll probably be able to continue to ruin Venezuela without any foreign interference. As a libertarian, how do you counter abuses such as by factory owners over factory workers? Well, I didn't say I was libertarian. I just said what I meant to say is, you know, American culture leans libertarian, and that American libertarian ethos makes people here, including myself, a little skeptical about centralized party systems.
I thought you were saying that American politics has a libertarian element to it.
Well, that's true, too.
Yeah.
I would say that's also accurate. In general, there is a more, in general, on the broad political spectrum, American politics leans, on average, more to the right compared to other countries. So, I mean, even in that sense, it's more to the right. But yeah, definitely there's a libertarian bent to a lot of it, a kind of hyper-individualism. But to answer the question, how would a libertarian counter abuses such as factory owners over factory workers? I imagine the libertarian argument in that case would be that the workers would leave such a factory, would not work for such a factory, and that the factory would either go out of business or would stop those abuses so that they could get new hires. I believe that is the nominal logic there. But I think I've seen that issue come up before in philosophical debate. But nominally, that's how it's supposed to work. That kind of assumes a competitive market in which workers can do that, in which that's feasible. It also assumes rule of law such that the factory owner could not coerce them into staying. So if the central assumptions of the libertarian argument are met, then yeah, that's how it would work. But in a lot of cases, those assumptions are not met, and in that case, you kind of just don't. Assumptions are an important part of any policy or, you know, even philosophical debate. It's the assumptions that kind of get you. Especially those nasty unspoken assumptions. Those are the worst. You can extrapolate that even further. If you're a socially anxious person who has trouble dealing with people, unspoken social norms are the bane of your existence. Because you'll just blunder right into that shit. And nobody tells you. They just judge you.
How could you have not known this?
Yeah, that's just what they think.
Because I didn't know it.
Yeah.
Unacceptable.
Nobody's gonna believe that. So yeah, you get shit.
Why did you not know this? Everyone knows this. Everyone.
Yeah, so you blunder into that. You'll probably blunder into the same norm multiple times too, because people will just assume you know about it and are some kind of asshole, rather than thinking, oh, he doesn't know, I'll tell him. It's not as bad when you're younger, because when you're younger, people assume you're stupid. He's young, he doesn't know any better. Here's how it works. When you're older, that's when people really start assuming you know what you're doing. When you're older and you start violating norms, they think, oh, he's had plenty of time to learn, he's an asshole. We're gonna write that guy off. Anyway, not sure how I got onto that.
Libertarian factory owners.
Yeah, libertarian factory owners.
Judging you for your norms.
Oh, assumptions and philosophical debates, and then extrapolating that beyond that. Yeah. Even just learning social norms is itself difficult. So, you know, just in general, in living, it's hard to learn all of them, let alone in a philosophical debate, where the debate hinges on certain assumptions, some of which may be assumed or unspoken by one party or the other. Which is why they tend to drag out. I've met people who just refuse to engage in hypothetical philosophical debates or conversations specifically because of that problem. You know, I've had people tell me, look, we're just going to end up chasing each other's tails and it's not going to go anywhere and nobody will be able to agree on anything, so why bother? Let's just stick to the data. That's a very common academic perspective. What does the data say? We can talk about bullshit some other time, but what does the data say? Let's see. So the next question was the Keynesian thinking movement after the economic crisis of 1929 the cause of the following crisis, or just an individual way with no incidence on the future? Now, I don't think Keynesians really got a lot of political influence until after the Great Depression started, because it was kind of the Great Depression itself that gave voice to that perspective. You know, there was a lot of capital lying around, but it wasn't doing anything. There was machinery to work and workers to work the machinery, but the workers were not working the machinery. So what's the deal? What's the problem? What happened? And Keynesian economics and Keynesian theory offered a potential explanation and offered policy prescriptions that proposed to deal not only with the economic problem, but also with the human problem. You know, all these people who are unemployed, well, we can employ them and kind of jumpstart the economy and get things moving again. That was nominally the perspective. It had been around before that, but nobody really paid much attention to them. You know, it was a major field of macroeconomics. It is very much a macroeconomic theory. And it had currency there, but it just didn't have policy influence. And it really took the Great Depression throwing out a lot of the neoclassical laissez-faire economic policy people to kind of make room for the Keynesians. Now, if you mean after the economic crisis of '29, the cause of the following crisis, so if you mean by the following crisis, what, World War II, I guess you could say? You could. I might be misreading the question. I apologize if so. But basically, no, I don't think Keynesians caused any of the crises in the 30s or 40s. Now, you could argue that they worsened the Great Depression. I've heard that argumentation. There are people who argue that it would have been better to let the market sort itself out, and that by jump-starting, trying to get the government to jump-start the economy by launching all of these regulations and interventions and whatnot, that they actually made it worse because they made investors more risk-averse and less willing to invest and more paranoid about the investment climate. And in that sense, it kind of caused a downturn. In fact, you could look at the data and you could see that the economy was recovering before, I think, 1934, 35, something around there, and then suffered another sharp recession after the initial big recession in 1929. So some people say that was because of mismanagement by the Roosevelt administration, and that if they'd just left well enough alone, then eventually there would have been a more natural recovery. I haven't studied that issue in depth, so I can't comment too much more on it beyond that. And it's a difficult issue because it gets real deep into the data. You got to get real deep into the analysis to do that, because that's some real true blue economics research type stuff. I'd like to get into it someday. I've dabbled in it now and again. But if you could elaborate a bit on the question, that might be helpful. If I am misreading the question, please do kind of clarify for me. I'm not always the brightest bulb in the box, so I apologize if I'm kind of mixing the crux of the question here. It would not be the first time. Let's see. Oh, I did this out of order, didn't I? I did the Venezuela question first and then Keynesian question. Can you tell me about symbolic interaction used by the barbarian tribes along the Danube? Was there resistance to Rome akin to collectivism? I cannot tell you about that because I have not studied interaction between barbarian tribes along the Danube. I have not read about them. I'm a little more familiar with the Germanic tribes along the Rhine, but not so much along the Danube. That's pretty new territory for me. Well, unexplored territory for me, so to speak. So I'd have to read a lot more about that to give a substantive answer. It wouldn't surprise me if it were collective, though. I don't want to bullshit my way through an answer, but I'm going to anyway, because it's an interesting topic. But it wouldn't surprise me if they were collectivist, because it is more of a tribal arrangement. And tribal societies in general are inherently more collectivist. And this is something that pops up in economic research. In general, tribes are an example of a managed economy, because all of the decisions, or at least a lot of the decisions, are made collectively. And there's not really private ownership per se. Personal ownership, yes, but not necessarily private ownership. Generally, ownership is more communal, tribal, so to speak. So, given that these societies are generally characterized as tribal, and I assume they're tribal, again, I'd have to read more to be sure, but if that assumption is true, then yeah, they probably would have been much more collectivist in nature. So was there resistance to Rome akin to collectivism? Kind of. I do remember reading about, what was his name? I don't think I can remember his name, but I think he was the forebearer of the Ostrogoths, maybe? Don't quite remember. Basically, there was a lot of tribes living along the border on the Danube, and the Romans tried to kind of Romanize them to varying degrees. And what they would do is they would force them to be soldiers. and they would use them as their guards, basically. They would man the legions along the border and would help keep the other barbarian groups in line. And there was this one guy who grew up in the Roman military, so he was Romanized, but he was actually like a prince of this one tribe. I think it was Ostrogoths or some damn thing. And eventually, he turned on Rome. You know, I don't know if it was because he didn't get the promotion he wanted, or there was some catalyst that drove him away from Rome and back to his tribe, and he raised a coalition, not only of his people, but of a number of other tribes along the Danube. I believe it was along the Danube. And he launched an invasion of Rome that eventually ended in its sacking. And in that case, if that's what you mean by resistance, then that you could paint that as collectivist, because that was definitely a large coalition he built out of those tribes. But I guess I'm not real sure what you mean by collectivism. What does resistance as collectivism look like? Or more accurately, what does resistance as collectivism look like? I'm not quite sure what's meant by that. Even if I were, I probably wouldn't be able to answer because, again, not quite my topic. I don't quite know enough about it. But if it's a tribe, then yeah, probably tribal in nature. And whether or not the resistance was akin to collectivism, there certainly was a collective effort to attack Rome once certain leaders, like the guy I was talking about, started building coalitions and taking advantage of the weakness and incoherence of Roman governance. So sorry, that's not a great answer. But like I said, it's not quite my topic. Hopefully the bullshit version of the answer was satisfactory. How would you respond to someone who denies the Holocaust? It depends on the context. Like if I'm watching a YouTube video and then somebody mentions that they don't believe it happened and that they're a Holocaust denier, then I would probably just shrug and say, eh, those people exist. If somebody casually drops in a party, oh yeah, I don't think the Holocaust happened, I would probably be a little more direct. Because that, well, if I have an opening to talk about history, I generally take it. If I'm comfortable enough and I don't have too much social anxiety, yeah, that's an opening for me. So I might jump in there and I get into that, like, why do you think that? What's the evidence there? There's a lot of evidence that it kind of did happen. How do you address that evidence, etc.? You know, just kind of have a conversation. Because generally, crazy people, well, alright, I don't want to say everybody who believes the Holocaust didn't happen is crazy. But let's be fair to those of you who are Holocaust deniers listening. You have to admit you have something of a bad reputation. That being the case, the kind of people who deny the Holocaust are generally pretty colorful. So even if they are batshit crazy, you can generally get an interesting conversation out of them, I would wager. And if nothing else, you can get a better read on their reasons for believing that, or pretending to believe it anyway.
Well, I think the key thing that's missing between denying something that existed, such as the dinosaurs, for example, versus the Holocaust, involves the oppression of different groups of people, where if you fall into one of the categories of people who maybe you were tortured, exterminated, or tested upon during the Holocaust, that's going to make you feel pretty uncomfortable, I would think. Say, for example, you have a relative who survived the Holocaust and has lots of stories and was maybe wounded or damaged through that process. There's a lot going on there. I mean, maybe you deny the moon landing and Buzz Aldrin punches you in the face. That happens. Denying the Holocaust, I think, carries some more implications with it that are really dangerous for the well-being of other people who exist. It's not just one of those harmless things of, yeah, I don't believe in some particular aspect that doesn't really influence anyone. It's kind of a big deal to deny the Holocaust, so I would be upset.
Yeah. Well,
I'm not Jewish, but I would be upset because Jewish people are people.
But I think that bleeds into another conversation about where do you draw lines. Like, to what degree is it polite or necessary or should be required even to show deference to groups who have suffered or are disadvantaged, or are oppressed, or what have you. And that's a big debate going on right now since the Alex Jones thing happened. Did you follow that?
Yeah, I know he's been basically wedged out of a lot of different platforms that he's been on.
Mm-hmm. And there's a big debate about how correct that is, whether it was the right thing to do, whether it's overreach. I mean, there's a whole debate there about how much of a voice do you give people who have opinions that could be damaging to a community in some way.
I think the difference, too, is I believe some of his opinions are actually breaking the law,
mm-hmm.
which presents its own problem beyond just being really mean or insensitive, or even propagating false information. There's a point where it's going to run into United States legal code, which is just beyond the, that's not very nice, Alex Jones is a mean guy. It's like, you're actively breaking the law, and your platform is creating perspectives that are, like, really disruptive to just the well-being of Americans in general.
Mm-hmm.
That are also false.
Yeah. Yeah, but then that gets into the question of to what degree should the law be enforcing the latter as opposed to the former. If there is defamation happening, that's illegal, for sure. Or slander, or something to that effect. Does that then mean, though, that he should not have that platform available to him? Mind you, he has not yet been convicted for that case. The case in question was brought by one of the parents of the Sandy Hook kids. There's a big gun massacre here in the U.S., and a number of children were killed, and Alex Jones famously came out and said it was a false flag operation, it was all fake, all of those people, all those parents were crisis actors, etc., and a whole bunch of other stuff. And I think what got him into trouble in particular was when he said that one particular parent was, I think in particular he said that he was a crisis actor working for the government to do this, that, or the other. Some very specific thing that that gave grounds for the slander case that was brought against him. Or maybe it wasn't slander, but defamation, I think technically is what it was. I'm not quite sure on the details there, but basically there was a very specific reason for that case to be brought, and it was brought. Does that mean that, given that he has not yet been convicted, and even if he is, does that mean he doesn't deserve to have access to those platforms? Those are private platforms, so do not Facebook, Twitter, etc. not have the right to decide who can use them anyway? Is it not kind of a moot point whether or not he should lose them, given that it's not really society writ large's decision anyway? Should it be society writ large's decision anyway? And do those comments actually cause substantive damage to certain groups? Certainly they cause distress, but is distress enough damage to warrant some degree of censorship or de facto censorship? Those are thorny questions, none of which are going to be answered tonight. We're not going to blow through those and settle them here, but those are really difficult questions, and that's kind of where Holocaust denial ties in, because that's hard to demarcate those borders, because different people will have different opinions on that. Obviously, I would like to think anyway, most people are against Holocaust denial. I've met somebody who survived the Holocaust, so I feel pretty confident it happened. Personally, that's just me. What do I know? But personally, pretty confident. But that said, there is that conversation about what is the space for that, or is there a space for that? And I think there is a debate there. Even if it is a one-sided debate, even though I think a lot of us, including those people listening, probably would come down on one particular side of that debate. Even if there is a one-sided, lopsided debate, it should be had. That should be there, so that we can figure out that. Because one of the problems we have in society right now is that we have no social norms or social institutions to govern this new space in social media that's been created. It really is kind of Wild West right now. I mean, mobs are attacking people, people are saying crazy shit. I mean, it's pretty wild. We have no real social norms in place to kind of govern how we react to that or deal with it. And right now we're focusing disproportionately on rules. Either corporate rules on the part of the companies that run social media, or on the part of the government, which should do more or should basically have control of it in some cases. There's a lot of arguments on all sides on that. But wherever you come down, there really has to be fleshed out, and there has to be, beyond specific rules, informal rules, social norms that govern that space. And once we have those, I think regardless of how you want to design the specific corporate or government rules, things will ease up considerably once there is broad acceptance of how this space should look and how people should behave in that space. Because then it'll be much easier for people to agree on how to take action. Like if one guy is wearing his pants on his head and running around naked in front of a school, everybody agrees because of informal norms that that's a bad thing. And so it's very easy to build a consensus to pass a law that says that can't happen. Once we have a similar mechanism play out on the internet with regard to social media, we'll be able to very easily and with much more consensus deal with problems like those presented by the Alex Joneses of the world, the Holocaust deniers of the world, etc.
Holy shit, there are multiple of them?
Oh god, yes. They're everywhere.
Alex Jones clones. Save us.
Oh yeah. You know, you can take Alex Jones off of Twitter, but there's going to be 10 more to take his place. They may not be called Alex Jones, but you can be sure they'll be him in spirit. They're not going anywhere.
A
big reason.
There is one counter argument. You were talking about debates of certain topics.
Yeah.
For a certain level of absurd, it adds a layer of legitimacy to a certain absurd perspective if you give them a platform in a formal debate. Like one example, I don't know if you heard of Bill Nye versus Ken Ham. It was a creationism debate, and a lot of people were like, wow, this is cool. Bill Nye is trying to engage and talk about science and stuff like that. But by kind of meeting with this guy, it almost creates the illusion that there are two choices and the public is not sure yet. Scientists are unsure, which it's not quite like that. It does create that 50-50 illusion when you do have a debate to the person who's unsure of the topic. If they're not familiar and they don't really have a stance yet, they see two people talking from the outset and it's like, all right, well, I guess we don't know yet, so these guys are going to try to find out. As opposed to one side has all the evidence, effectively, and the other side is trying to dismiss the evidence. That's very different from, say, two competing scientific theories, and they're still undecided on which one is true.
Yeah.
One has a mountain of evidence and one does not. So for something like Holocaust denial, I feel like that's something that a lot of people would argue isn't really worth debating because the answer is so obvious, and by debating, you almost make it seem like there's more legitimacy to that option than there actually is.
That's true. I think there is a lot of substance to that assessment. And I would agree with that there is probably more legitimacy given to that perspective when it is debated in that way. But I also think, and you know, we're kind of getting into the realm of preferences now, because there reaches a point in any policy discussion where people move beyond just what we know to more what we prefer. So I would agree with you on that count. And so what do we do about that? What do we do about the fact that certain perspectives, especially certain very negative perspectives, are lent credence by their very debate? Do we respond to that by limiting that kind of speech? If so, by how much? And if not, where do you draw the line? Are there some types of speech that are so appalling or so repugnant or so dangerous that you have to draw a line somewhere, or is there nothing? Now, my personal preference is that of a free speech absolutist. That's always been my perspective. So for me, yes, those perspectives get more legitimacy than they would have otherwise, but by having those debates out in the open, you're able to really attack them much more thoroughly. Whereas if they're in the shadows, they're always there, they don't get addressed, and they can fester and spread much more proficiently.
I think that works really well for people who have some sort of educational background, academic background, where they understand the rules of the debate. Because one thing that always stands out to me when I watch a, say, theology versus atheism or whatever sort of debate is each side knows how to pander to their base, and usually there's going to be one participant in the debate who is more charismatic than the other, and an uneducated listener to a debate oftentimes is going to favor the person not necessarily who is logically correct, but who is more charismatic, who is appealing to their emotions and the way that they feel about the world and confirming a lot of their suspicions and that kind of thing, rather than the person who, in the true debate sense, is correct. I agree with you that if you have an arena to bat down stupid ideas, then people who are aware of logic, that makes it super apparent. Like, that was one of the most powerful devices for me moving away from my religious beliefs, was watching Christopher Hitchens debate theologians. I just saw this happen, and it was like, they're just getting destroyed. Hitchens is crushing them. Like, why can no one beat this guy? It's clear that he's winning. He's kind of mean to them, but he's right. Like, his logic is more sound. But I think a lot of people who would watch that same debate, they want to believe that their side is correct if they're religious, and they're going to say, Hitchens is mean, my guy is nice, and he's talking to me in a way that I've been talked to before, so I prefer to listen to my side. So I think debate can be really good for some people, but it's not going to be the most effective method for everyone.
Mm-hmm. For sure. You know, there are definitely people who cannot resist confirmation bias and for whom debates are contests and not exchanges of information and perspective. But I don't think those people are going to be saved. You know, I don't think you can save the peasantry by protecting them from ideas. And that's just, again, that's my personal perspective and preference. Mm-hmm. I think it's better to have that out in the open where people can fight over the peasantry rather than leaving the peasantry to their own devices in the shadows where we can't really see what they're doing and God knows what they believe. You know, racism is a good example. Racism has not been completely purged from the public discourse, but it's been significantly reduced. But it's definitely still there. And I would argue that it would be better to have it out in the open so that we can measure it and judge it and attack it, rather than having it in the shadows where it's just going to stay. Like, you can put all the pressure you want on racism and racists, but all that does is drive it underground. And as you can ask any authoritarian government about how hard it is to stamp out dissenting political opinions, and they'll be happy to tell you all about how impossible it is. Unless you take really draconian measures, it is almost impossible to snuff out a political perspective from your society. And I don't think, short of draconian measures, that the United States is going to be able to stamp out something like racism. And in general, that's why I have the free speech absolutist perspective, that better to fight the battles out in the open than to not. And I'm, you know, again, I recognize that your perspective has total validity, and I totally get that. And, you know, again, it comes, you can kind of tell me if I'm wrong on this, but that comes down to preferences on how much, where does responsibility lie in dealing with ignorant people? You know, given that we know the damage that ignorant people can do, and, you know, I would argue that ignorance is a stage, not a condition. You know, there are ignorant people who cannot be ignorant, and there are people who are not ignorant that can become ignorant. So for sure, it's not something like there's a real ignorant peasantry out there that is permanently ignorant.
Well, I would say ignorance is a spectrum, too. And that's part of the, I guess, the less fun answer to a lot of these questions. And we've talked about this in tons of our conversations in the past, of that the answer to most stuff is going to be, well, it's a distribution, or it's a systemic problem, or it's a spectrum, which isn't quite as satisfying and simple than saying, oh, it's these motherfuckers over here, like, they're causing the problem, and we need to stop them. Like, that appeals to primate intuition much better than, well, racism is a systemic problem, and we're fighting against it, but a lot of its expression is subtle and indirect rather than as overt as it used to be, but it's still there, so we still need to do work. Like, it's not as, like, simple an answer as you could get, and then you just listen to it and you say, okay, and then I can move on, and I've basically figured that out. It's one of those things that's kind of a hot mess, and it's a work in progress, and it's complicated, and no one's going to be able to explain it perfectly, so good luck.
Yeah, I mean, framing it, like you say, framing it in the first place is difficult to do. And that's the first step towards having the debate, is deciding, what are you debating? You know? And then once you do that, you have the difficult problem of building consensus, and it's difficult to build consensus when, like you say, you have this very broad spectrum of possible policy responses that you can take.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many different perspectives and opinions, and to say nothing of ideologies and, you know, all that jazz, that altogether it makes for a very difficult political environment to navigate for those who are looking for real social change and real substantive reform to deal with these very difficult and real problems. So I hope I didn't make too much of an ass out of myself. I think I was relatively clear on some of that. I try. It's hard with the sensitive subjects to make sense, because generally I try to stick more with the descriptive stuff. But once you get into opinion territory, it's really hard to navigate, because a lot of that is personal preference and background and, you know, all that jazz. So
Yeah,
I hope I didn't come across as an asshole. That wasn't my intent.
No, you're good. I think part of it, for a lot of viewers, and myself included, a lot of times you have people talking about the very clear stuff, the history, the facts, but there is that desire to be like, well, what's your opinion as well? And as long as you preface it with that it's your opinion and it's not the gospel truth, then there's some room for shooting the shit and talking about stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think I was pretty clear that most of that was opinion.
You've gotten like 3 compliments on your voice during this stream.
Oh, well, thank you. I wish I looked as good as I sounded.
Wow. Just leave it to your imagination, chat. He's ripped, he's a hunk. He hits the gym 5 times a day. And he only eats kale and drinks water. It's amazing.
Oh god, I couldn't imagine.
We were joking about kale the other day, if it's the vegetable you eat when you want to punish yourself.
You know, it's especially funny for me because just yesterday I was house sitting, and I didn't know what to do. I probably should have just done some research, but I was in a new place and I didn't want to take all my kit over, so I didn't really have any good way to get on the internet. So I figured I'll just watch their Netflix and eat a family-sized meal of chicken tenders. That was the plan. It was pretty fantastic.
Nice.
Yeah, recommendation. Koba and the Two Strings. Very good movie. Really liked it.
Nice. Have you seen Moana?
You know, I haven't yet, actually.
Moana is basically, if you look at the history of the 90s of Disney trying to make movies about demographics that are not white people, most of them has been disastrous, like Pocahontas is a mess. Moana is like the Pocahontas that they realized their mistake and they tried to fix it, and they got a bunch of people who are of like Pacific Islander descent and whatnot, and it's a lot more accurate to that kind of stuff. It's not perfect, obviously, like the main producers were still white guys, but it's really fun. It's a very simple kind of feel-good watch, but yeah, it's pretty cool. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson singing songs.
Oh god.
It's good stuff.
How did that happen?
He's talented. Like, he's not an opera singer or anything, but he knows how to hit a note, so I feel like it's tolerable. It's better than Ewan McGregor trying to use a French accent. I guess that's not saying very much.
Well, more power to The Rock. Or
Yeah.
Dwayne Johnson, or whatever he's calling himself these days.
Did you hear about the drama with him and DJ Khaled? I don't know if we talked about that back in the day. This would have been like about 6 months ago.
If we did, I forgot.
Well, DJ Khaled, internet rest him, he's a meme. Have you heard of him?
No.
Okay.
I'm not well in touch with the zeitgeist.
Okay, well, he's a very goofy person. Can someone link that video real quick of just the first one that put him on the map, and I'll put it in the Discord for Agent Smith. But you can watch this video after and you'll understand what I'm getting at. He's a guy who is like a hip-hop sort of rap producer guy, and he's really silly, and he kind of fancies himself an existential philosopher in a way, but it's very basic and simple information that any random person is capable of saying or understanding, but he says it in a kind of charismatic and hilarious way. So he's famous on the internet now because of these memes. And he was on this talk show talking about how he was able to receive certain pleasure from his partners, but was not going to reciprocate because he is the king or lord or something. He's talking really stupid about this, and this blew up to the point where The Rock even responded to this, and he just tweeted something along the lines of, "I take pride in the excellence of all of my performances," or something like that. So he's generally a very PG, kind of family-friendly guy, but that was one little step across the line there that was pretty amusing. I like the guy. I appreciate The Rock.
Yeah, he's a good dude. You know, I remember him. He's generally well liked by the people he works with. He's pretty personable. He's just a giant dude, so he's not afraid of anything. He doesn't have to be an asshole.
Samoan.
There's no reason. Is he?
He's Samoan.
Oh, I thought he was like, huh. Interesting.
Yeah, that's why they got him for the role, because he is Pacific Islander.
Well, it's a good thing they did. You wouldn't have known otherwise, would you?
He was pretty good in Walking Tall. That was one of my favorite
I didn't
movies that
see the
he's
new
been
one,
in.
but I did see the original.
I didn't know there was a new one. Yeah, I saw the first one. Okay, I linked you the DJ Khaled video.
Oh, thank you.
You know, what's his name? Ah, shit, that philosopher who's like a word salad guy.
Oh, the Slovakian guy?
No. Slavoj Zizek, he's legitimate. He has a funny way of speaking, but I think a lot of his ideas are sound. What's his name? It starts with a D. Forget his name.
What were some of his ideas?
That quantum mechanics and consciousness and spirituality and God are all connected to the same thing. He like lumps physics, neuroscience, chemistry, and a bunch of different stuff, psychology, all into the same sentence.
Oh, is this that Indian guy? I think you mentioned
yeah.
him last week.
Deepak Chopra, thank you. Thank
There
you,
you
DF
go.
Grip. We got it. Yeah, he's like the Deepak Chopra of hip-hop. This DJ Khaled guy.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah.
I'll have to look him up.
Yeah, well, I linked the video, so you probably don't need to watch more than 2 minutes of him to understand.
Neat.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, we've had a good talk here today. I think I'm about ready to wrap up.
Well, I want to throw in here one final thing, which is that I'm in no way an expert on censorship or social issues or any of that jazz. So I'm not speaking from a position of authority when we're talking about Holocaust denial or Twitter or Alex Jones or any of the issues surrounding those things. So for sure, that's definitely more editorializing than speaking from any kind of strong background in those things on my part. Please don't. Please
How
don't.
can you
mock.
be a pundit if you keep saying stuff like this at the end of the conversation?
I don't want to be a pundit.
Okay.
I just want to review cool things that happened in history and that are happening now, and give people information with which to make up their own minds,
Wow.
so that they can be as crazy as they want to be with the best information possible.
You just have a broadsword slicing through the bullshit of political media. Amazing. Thank you, Agent Smith. And
We'll
thank
try.
you, Strophium, and thank you, chat, for the questions and interaction today. You should read the chat later. The Djibouti period was pretty amusing.
I look forward to it.
We just can't help it. We're animals at the end of the day.
Well, that'll be fun.
Yeah.
Shout out to the French people listening. I noticed we have 7 tonight.
Nice. Well, it's like early morning there. They're dedicated.
They can make fun of my pronunciation of Emmanuel Macron.
Macron.
They always have before. I don't doubt they won't now.
Alright, well, this was episode 35. It will be on YouTube shortly. 34 is already on YouTube. these have been getting like 500, 600 views now, so you're famous. So if people talk to you on the street corner and they're like, you sound just like this guy on this Twitch or stream randomly on Sunday nights called Agent Smith, and you're like, oh my god. So don't be surprised if people ask you for your autograph, okay?
Wow, I haven't felt this humble since I was internet famous the last time. I had my name, when I Google image searched my name, I was one of the top returns, so I felt a little bit famous. I was like, oh wow, I'm one of the top guys with my name. Nice. So thank you, Neuro, for helping propel me to this level of infamy.
Stardom.
This level of stardom, yeah, that's probably more accurate, isn't it?
Infamy. It makes it sound like you're on wanted posters.
No, we'll get to the infamy stage after I get drugged out and lose my shit and go through that whole stage of rock star status. I guess for me it won't so much be drugs as it will be French bread, but still.
Alright, dude. Well, have a good week. Great talking to you.
Thanks
for hanging out. We'll see you next Sunday.
See you next Sunday.
Keep it real.